Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're setting out on one of the most famous journeys in all of world literature, a story of monks, demons, gods, and one very rebellious monkey. This is Journey to the West, the tale of Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, and his long pilgrimage to India in search of sacred texts. It's a story that blends myth, folklore, religion, and adventure, told and retold for centuries across China and beyond. We'll meet a trickster born from stone, a monk chosen by destiny, and companions who faced endless trials on the road to wisdom. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down for the night or simply curious about the legends that shaped cultures far from your own, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. On the far edge of the known world, there is a mountain that looks as if it were set down by a god who did not care to explain himself. The cliffs of Flower Fruit Mountain lift out of the sea like the back of a black turtle, slick with mist and ringed in white spray. Pines cling to ledges where no root should hold. Water pours out of the rocks in a silver veil that never runs dry. Cranes cry in the high air, and gibbons answer them. And sometimes the cloud is so thick that the summit seems to float, a lonely island adrift upon the sky. In the heart of that mountain lay a stone that was not like other stones. Wind and moonlight and the breath of earth had worked upon it for ages beyond counting until it held a pulse of its own. When the season turned and the world was ripe, the stone split with a sound like thunder muffled in snow, and a child stepped forth, not of woman born, bright-eyed and grinning, already seeking mischief. He walked before he learned to fear, and laughed before he learned to doubt. Monkeys found him and claimed him, because every tribe knows its king when it sees him. They led him along ledges and dripping stairs of moss to the place where the waterfall fell like a curtain of silk. The elders said that any beast brave enough to pass through the sheet of water and find a way within would rule them by right. The child did not ask for a vote. He leaped. The water took him, and he vanished in the roar. When he emerged, he was shouting with delight from inside a hidden cavern lit by a seam of daylight and a scatter of cold stars. There were chambers and pools and sleeping ledges, a palace carved by time and patient water, vast enough to shelter a tribe. He beckoned the others in with both hands, and the monkeys danced and screeched and crowned him their handsome monkey king. He took the throne of a stone chair and felt it fit his back as if it had been waiting. For a time there was nothing but ease. He taught his people to bathe in hot springs, to pluck the best wild peaches, to scare leopards with noise and rolling stones. He hunted boldly and shared without counting. Each morning began with laughter, and each night ended with full bellies and the gentle lap of the cave river on the rock. Then one summer a storm rolled off the sea and the rain came like falling rope and an old monkey died. The king sat beside the stiffening body, and a thought crept in like cold. The wind would strip every tree bare. The water would carve even this mountain to sand. The oldest will go, and then the young. Joy cracks when it is asked to carry eternity. He felt a tightness in his chest that all his strength could not break. He asked the elders what could be done against such a law. They told him there was nothing. He rose before dawn and watched the eastern sky pale and decided the elders were wrong. He left his tribe in the care of lieutenants and went out into the world. He stole a raft from fishermen and learned the color of deep waves. He walked through towns where men bent their backs to tax collectors and bowed their heads to magistrates with hard mouths, and he made a game of snatching fruit from market stalls without being seen. In the mountains inland he listened to hermits who spoke in riddles about stillness and breath, and he learned that the world is full of doors, but most men only try the ones they can see. Sailors spoke of a master who lived beyond a forest and a river and a frozen pass, and would take no student unless the stars themselves were willing. The Monkey King grinned at that and went to find him. The hermitage of the patriarch Subodhi hid itself among cypresses, the trunks straight as spears, the air clean and very thin. There were no guards, and there was no gate. The master sat beneath a cliff in a robe the colour of dust and looked at the newcomer without surprise, as if this meeting had been arranged in a winter before men kept calendars. He asked the monkey what he sought. The answer came at once: to live as long as heaven and earth, to bow to no magistrate, to know the tricks behind the curtain. The master laughed with his eyes and told him to stand in the line with the rest. There were young men rich with perfume and old men gaunt with yearning. They tried to meditate and fell asleep. They spoke of virtue and counted the hours. The monkey waited and did not count. When the wind was sharp, he wrapped his tail around his feet, and when it was hot, he slept on the stone. He did the chores that no one liked. He carried water and he kept the cook fire bright. In the quiet before dawn, the master called him aside as if by accident and asked for his name. The monkey had none that would serve in a place like this. Names have power. The master said that he would be called Sun, to bind him with a clan and a sound. He said that his personal name would be Wukong, which means one who has woken to emptiness. Not the emptiness of despair, but the emptiness that makes room for all things. The syllables fell into the air like pebbles into a spring. The monkey listened to the ring they made. Subodhi taught by hints and by blows of the stick. He taught breathing that made the body light and quiet, so that a heartbeat could be hidden from ghosts and soldiers alike. He taught the way to ride a cloud, which is not the same as flying but is faster than any horse, a single somersault that crosses 1,000 li when the breath is right and the mind is steady. He taught the art of transformations, not only the flash of feather and fang but the patience to become a tree in a field until a hawk lands and forgets you are not bark. He taught recipes for longevity that had nothing to do with stolen peaches or stolen pills. Some were a matter of herbs and stone, but the best of them were a matter of stillness and the refusal to squander the breath on foolishness. The monkey learned quickly and did not hide his cleverness, which is how cleverness often breaks its own ankle. There were rules at the hermitage, though no one wrote them down. The first was that power is not a show to be made before the idol. The second was that the world loves balance and will punish anything that grows too fast or shines too bright. The master told Sun Wukong to keep his head low and his tail still. Sun Wukong promised to try, and meant it when he said it, and then forgot when the afternoon grew long. He could not help but laugh when a proud novice slipped on wet stone, and could not help but boast a little when a lesson that humbled the rest yielded to him on the first attempt. Subodhi rapped him on the brow with the tip of a staff, and left a bruise that wore away slowly. "Remember the bruise," said the old man, "and remember that pride is a rope that can strangle as well as pull." Seasons turned while the cypresses watched without blinking. The Monkey King became a student, and then something like a son. He learned enough to keep death waiting at a distance. He learned enough to make the world lean in to listen. One night, when the stars were sharp as nails, Subodhi called him to the terrace and sent him away. The teaching had been given, The rest would be the work of time and choice. Power seeks its path. If you remain, the mountain will be your prison. If you go, the world will be your teacher. Sun Wukong bowed, not very well, and hid the sting in his eyes. He left before dawn with nothing in his hands and 10,000 tricks tucked away in his bones. He crossed back over passes that seemed smaller than he remembered. He reached the sea again and watched the water lift and fall in long breath. The name that the master had given him sat warm on his tongue. He said it once into the wind, and the wind carried it like a promise. He thought of the waterfall and the hidden cave and the tribe that had waited. He thought of the old fear that had sent him out and felt it loosen. Perhaps death could be cheated, or at least delayed until the stars forgot their count. He smiled the smile of a king who has learned a craft and not yet learned its price, and he turned his face toward Flower Fruit Mountain, where a throne of stone and a nation of laughing voices were ready to greet him. He came back to Flower Fruit Mountain with the quiet of a storm that has not yet broken. The tribe saw him and went to their knees, for something in his step was different now. He moved as if the air made way for him. He looked into the cave he had first claimed and saw how small it was compared to what he had learned to hold inside his chest. He gave orders in a voice that carried to the far terraces. Send watchers to the bays, post runners on the ridgeline, keep the pools clean, teach the young to grip a branch with confidence instead of fear. A kingdom of monkeys had become a court, and the court had a ruler who understood time. Power brings appetite. He wanted a weapon that would match his temper, and a coat that would not part under tooth or iron. Stories told of the Dragon Palace beneath the eastern sea, a walled city set among reefs where pearl lamps burned in the dark, and shrimp soldiers patrolled causeways of green stone. He dove into the sea, went down beyond the cold layer, and walked the halls of Ao Guang, Dragon King of the East. Courtiers bowed and spoke soft words. The king offered spears and halberds that flashed like fish along a knife. The monkey hefted each, smiled, and shook his head. None of them sang in his hand. A minister with old eyes muttered of a relic left from the days of Great Yu when floods tried to drown the world. A measuring pillar, a calming needle set in the deep to keep the sea from turning again. It lay in a storehouse where even dragons seldom went. They took him there. The chamber smelled of salt and old iron. In the center stood a bar of black metal thick as a millstone, and capped with rings that remembered chains. He touched it and felt it wake. The writing along its length named it the compliant golden hoop staff. It could grow until it knocked at the roof of the sky, or shrink until it hid behind an ear. He lifted it with one hand and laughed, because it wanted him as much as he wanted it. The laughter did not please the host. Dragons do not enjoy seeing strangers walk off with their anchors, but the Monkey King was a guest only in the most generous sense of the word. He tucked the staff into his ear as if it were a needle, and when the guards closed ranks he reached into his fur, plucked a hair, blew on it, and turned one into 100. The doubles swarmed like bees, and the dragon soldiers broke before them. Ao Guang stopped the fight with a show of grace and tried tribute instead. A phoenix feather cap for the head, cloud-walking boots for the feet, a chainmail shirt that gleamed like fish scales for the chest. The courtiers smiled as if a debt had been settled. Sun Wukong smiled as if he had taken only what the world owed him. The underworld heard of this and took it ill. That night, when he slept with the sound of the surf in his ears, 2 officials with the heads of an ox and a horse came to seize his spirit and haul it before the 10 kings. He woke to shackles and a courtroom of stone lit by blue fire. Scrolls crackled, lists were unrolled. The clerks read out his allotted years and the years of his tribe with the efficiency of a mill grinding grain. He listened, then asked for the register and a brush. The clerk scoffed. He was there to learn humility. He was not there to write. He broke the inkstone across a judge's jaw and began to cross out names. His name first, then the names of the elders who had followed him since the waterfall, then the names of the children who had sat on his shoulders. The ink dried like iron. Ox head and horse face fled the bench. The 10 kings called for chains that would hold a mountain. He broke them. The court fell into panic. He walked out through a door that had not been there an hour before, and woke on the mountain with the taste of smoke in his mouth. Death would not claim him by ledger again. Word travels quickly when it is bad news. The Jade Emperor in the high heaven heard that a monkey had taken a sea pillar, stolen armor, shamed the underworld, and told mortality to wait. Some in the court called for soldiers. Others, who had lived long enough to know the price of a war, urged a slower hand. Tai-Bai Jing-sing, the old star of Venus, suggested courtesy. Invite the creature to heaven. Give him a place to sit and a task to keep him busy. Let a title soothe what force could not. The suggestion pleased the hall. An envoy descended to Flower Fruit Mountain with birds in his wake and a smile that hid many teeth. He spoke of honor and harmony and the emperor's kindness. Sun Wukong liked the sound of the words king and honor. He liked the idea of a place where the wineskins never emptied. He accepted. Heaven Gate is a bright thing. Terraces of white that blind the eye. Halls with roofs like waves caught in gold. Servants who never tire. He bowed as much as he had to and walked beside Tai-Bai under a colonnade where cranes stalked and officials pretended not to stare. The decree named him keeper of the heavenly stables. He was to care for the imperial steeds, the creatures that pull the chariots of cloud and carry envoys between palaces of light. At first he took pride in it. He rose at dawn and groomed manes that trailed sparks. He watered horses who drank thunder. He taught lazy grooms to work with their hands instead of their voices. The animals loved him. They recognized a kindred appetite for space and speed. He fed them peaches from the lesser groves and laughed at their warm breath on his wrists. Respect is not the same as honor. In an idle hour he asked a clerk about his rank and was told with a polite cough that it was a minor post and an old one. He was not a marshal. He was not a lord of seasons or thunder. He was a servant in a fine coat. The laughter he gave then had no humor in it. He remembered the bruise Sir Bodhi had left on his brow and felt an older bruise begin to form under the skin. When a banquet was announced in the palace of the Queen Mother, the invitations were gilded and the ink smelled of plum. Every name, from the Great Dipper down to the river sprites, was written in careful strokes. His was not. He learned this from a groom who read a list he was not supposed to see. He walked the peach garden that afternoon and looked at fruit that glowed with the slow light of years. The oldest peaches ripen once every 3,000 years, the clerks say. Bite them, and you will not count birthdays again. He picked one and held it to the sky. He thought of how he had been invited in order to be contained. He thought of how the court had smiled at him as a child is smiled at while being kept from the table. He ate the peach and let the juice run down his arm. Then he ate another. The taste was summer made flesh. He laughed and felt the tightness in his chest ease. He did not leave it at fruit. He walked into halls where he was not expected and found casks of wine set aside for the evening and grain offerings meant for immortals with spotless robes. He found a chamber where Laozi kept crucibles warm for the making of pills that promised untorn years. The scent was bitter and clean. He tipped a handful into his mouth and swallowed. The room tilted and steadied. He was drunk and calm and very awake. By the time the first musicians tuned in the banquet court, the damage had been done. A garden stripped of its rarest fruit, cellars lightened by more than a polite sip, a furnace with its stock reduced. The servants whispered and the whispers grew legs. They sent for him with smiles. Tai Bai Jing Sing spoke in the same soft tone he had used at the mountain. "Come, great sage, there is a misunderstanding. Sit, accept the courtesy of the court." He had heard enough of courtesy. He tied the phoenix feather cap on tight, tightened the straps of the cloud-walking boots, and picked up the iron staff that had slept behind his ear. He thanked the grooms in the stable who had worked with him honestly, and he left the palace before the first course was served. He fell through cloud until the air tasted of salt again, and the green spine of Flower Fruit Mountain rose to meet him. His tribe gathered and howled as he landed. He told them what heaven had offered and what it had meant. He told them he had a better name than any given by a clerk. He would be the great sage equal to heaven. He carved the words on a slab of stone at the mouth of the cave and stood before it until the mist drifted away and the marks dried. The title was a threat and a promise. The court above could pretend not to hear it for a day. They would not be able to pretend for long. The high heaven did not sleep after the stone monkey carved his new title on a mountain face. Courtiers paced galleries of cloud and polished jade, and every step sounded like a question no one wished to answer. The Jade Emperor kept his poise, but even poise has a cost. Advisors gathered beneath banners of the 5 directions and spoke in turns, each protecting his own pride as much as the order of heaven. Some wanted thunder generals and chains and a swift lesson taught on the nearest parade ground. Others had the longer memory that comes with age and warned that armies crush bodies but not hunger, and the creature they faced was hungry for standing. Tai Bai Jing Sing listened more than he spoke. He was the old star, the court's silver tongue, not because he loved flattery, but because he could count to 10 while outriders were still at 5. When the debate had dried to ritual, he bowed and gave an answer the hall could accept. Invite the upstart back. Give him what he has already taken in his heart. A title that flatters without surrendering 1 ounce of actual power. Call him great sage equal to heaven. Seat him at a side table. Keep him busy with a task that looks grand from a distance. Let the heat bleed out of the matter before someone is burned. It was pragmatic. It was safe. It was the only idea that did not taste like fear. So an envoy rode a river of light Flower Fruit Mountain, with smiles and silks and a decree that could have been a net. Sun Wukong heard the words and felt the shape of them. Great sage equal to heaven. The syllables pleased the ear, and the feeling of being recognized pleased him more. He took the invitation and went up through the bright gate again, this time not as a minor groom but as something like a peer. In the outer court, a lacquered plaque was hung with his new title carved deep. Attendants bowed with the measured respect reserved for noble guests and dangerous animals. The post that came with the honor was as delicate as a thread and nearly as binding. He was made overseer of the peach garden of the Queen Mother, the orchard that ripens in its own time and answers to no season. There the trees grow in ordered ranks along terraces where mist never quite lifts. The smallest fruit ripens once every few hundred years and gives grace to the tongue and lightness to the step. The larger kind ripens after a millennium and softens the bones of age. The rarest blossoms open once every 3,000 years and promise that death will be polite enough to wait. Fairies in pale robes tended the limbs with silk cords and knives of shell. They bowed to the new overseer and asked for his orders. He walked the rows at dawn and at dusk and learned the orchard the way a hunter learns the ground, by the way the air tastes when you are standing in the right place. Heaven congratulated itself on its own cleverness. The great sage had a corner of paradise to mind, and the court had its face back. Yet contempt is a poor gardener. In colonnades and side halls, Wukong caught the small smiles that say more than any proclamation. Official hospitality was exact and empty. When he asked for the scope of his authority, a clerk unfolded a scroll and spoke for a long time without saying anything. The message was plain enough. The title was gold leaf laid over wood. He bore it for a time because he wanted to see how far patience might carry him. He handled the orchard as if it belonged to him, and in a sense it did. He kept the fairies to their work and drove off lazy sprites who liked to nap on the lower branches. He stood watch when the oldest flowers opened, and even his restless heart went quiet at the sight. Those blooms did not belong to the court so much as to the world itself. In that season, the Queen Mother announced her banquet. It was to be a grand one, a gathering of all ranks and stations, a ceremony of plenty that would tell the universe that heaven was whole and at peace. Invitations went out with seals and red strings. The guest lists were copied and carried by runners with careful hands. As orchard overseer, Wukong was to provide the proper fruits in proper order for the feast. He accepted the duty without complaint and began to marshal the pickers, selecting only the ripest and most perfect, because pride is pride whether you are serving friend or foe. One evening near the wine hour he found two maidens of the orchard whispering over a folded slip of paper. They paled when they saw him and tried to hide it. He held out his hand, and the paper found its way there. It was a seating plan copied from the kitchens, all neat columns and ranked circles of names. He read it twice to be sure he had not missed a line. His title gleamed from a plaque outside, but his name was not on the parchment. There were places for the pole star and the gods of thunder, for river lords and mountain queens, for officials who had not earned their chairs since the last great war, and for poets whose verses had pleased the right ears. There was no place for the great sage equal to heaven, who would be busy in the groves cutting fruit. He carried the paper back to the tree where the two maidens waited, shifting from foot to foot like children who have broken a bowl. He thanked them and sent them on their way. Then he stood alone among branches that glowed with a soft blush and listened to his breath. It was steady. He did not rage. He did not throw the list into the irrigation channel and watch the ink run. He pocketed it and walked to the edge of the terrace and looked out over the cloud sea that lay below like a city sleeping. He had been given a name and denied a seat. They would praise the sweetness of peaches and toast order and sing of harmony while the hand that kept the orchard was told to stay among the trees. Tai-Bai Jinxing found him there before the stars came out. The old diplomat spoke with care. "This is ceremony. This is the way of courts. Do this well and better things will follow. The words were true in the way that words are often true and still not enough. Wukong listened and nodded. When the old star was gone, he walked back through the rows and laid a hand on the bark of the oldest tree. The sap rose with a slow pulse under his palm, as if the orchard itself were breathing. The kitchens began their work in earnest. Cooks argued over spice and smoke. Wine cooled in pools fed by snowmelt. The palace floors were scrubbed until they reflected the lamps, and in the orchard the fairies cut their ladders and wove their baskets and followed the overseer down the rows marked in the old books for picking. He spoke softly and told them which limbs to leave alone and which fruit to lift with both hands. He was exact because he could be exact, and because he understood that the only power they could not belittle was the power that comes from doing a thing so well that even enemies must approve. The day before the feast, a steward from the banqueting hall came to inspect the harvest. He wore a narrow smile and a robe with sleeves too clean for honest work. He counted the baskets and nodded, and made a note that pleased him. As he turned to leave, he spoke without looking up. Remember your place tomorrow. Do not wander beyond your trees. The words were casual. They were meant to slide past. They did not. Sun Wukong watched him go and felt the old bruise under the skin wake and darken. He had accepted a compromise because he wished to see if the court would accept him in return. Now he had his answer. There are moments when a man is told what he is worth, and once told, he must answer or be owned by the telling. He looked at the baskets, stacked like small hills, and at the paths that ran from terrace to terrace like lines on a palm. He understood the routes servants would take and the doors that would be left ajar. He understood kitchens and cellars and the places where rare things are kept until a bell is rung. When the sun went down, he gave his pickers the night off and told them to sleep. He sent the last of the sprites away with a kind word. He stood alone among the trees that hold time inside their fruit and made a simple plan. If heaven would not give him a seat at its table, he would attend in his own fashion and choose his own cup. The night before the feast, the peach garden was still. Lamps burned along the walks, and the fruit glowed like small moons between leaves. Sun Wukong walked the terraces as if making his final inspection, then stepped off the path and through a screen of branches where the oldest trees kept their own counsel. He chose a peach that had ripened through 3,000 years and split it with his teeth. The flesh was cool and sweet and left a clean light on the tongue. He ate a second and a third and left the stems lying like small bones in the grass. He crossed the inner courts without a servant seeing him. Kitchens steamed and clattered. Cellars were lined with great jars sealed with wax and red cord. He broke a seal and tipped a ladle. The wine had the easy strength of old mountains. He drank until his breath was warm and his step sure. Then he climbed the spiral stair to a quiet hall where the air smelled of pine and ash. Laozi kept his crucibles there. The old master was away. The furnaces banked a low fire. On a lacquered tray lay round pellets of cinnabar and jade, the patience of centuries pressed into a medicine the court called golden elixir. Sun Wukong cupped his hand and swallowed what would have supplied a dozen immortals. The pills slid into him like sparks into tinder. For a long moment he did not move. Then he laughed, softly at first, then at ease, as if he had solved a riddle the hall had been asking since it was built. The banquet opened with drums and a wash of silk. Lanterns trembled in the breath of 1,000 courtiers. The Queen Mother lifted her cup and the Jade Emperor inclined his head. At the door, a groom whispered to a steward and the steward went pale. Peach baskets were missing from the count. A cellar clerk could not find the key jar in its row. In the alchemy hall, a novice discovered an empty tray and a cold spot in the air where none should be. Before the first poem could be offered, the great sage walked into the outer court with the careless stride of a guest long expected. He bowed to the dais with the exact grace of one who knows the language of honor and is finished pretending it binds him. No one answered. The silence had teeth. He left the hall as easily as he had entered and went to fetch his staff. When the summons came for soldiers, the sound ran through the palaces like a winter wind. The thunder generals assembled with banners that cracked like ice. Marshal Li Jing took command, his 3-point spear flashing in the torchlight, and Prince Nezha stood at his side with wheels of fire turning at his heels. The first charge stormed the lower court and found only a laughing shadow. Hares plucked from the Monkey King leapt to life and became a host of Sun Wukongs, each swinging a black iron bar that grew and shrank like a living thing. The ranks broke in surprise. Order returned. Standards dressed. The second charge pressed hard and drove the shadows back to the garden wall. The real Sun Wukong met them there. He set the Ruyi staff against the paving stones and let it climb until it was a pillar taller than the peach towers, then brought it down like the fall of a gate. Stone shattered, plumes toppled. Nezha whirled in on rings of fire and met the stroke with his spear. The clash rang across the orchard and shook fruit from the high branches. Nezha's chains darted and caught a wrist. Wukong slipped the iron like water and became a hawk that lifted on the heat of the battle. Nezha rose after him on a current of flame. They fought in the upper air while the thunder generals loosed bolts that scorched the clouds. The hawk became a fish and dropped, and the fish became a tiger mid-fall, and the tiger became a monk with kindly eyes who begged the prince to spare a penitent. The kindness vanished with the next breath, and the iron staff cut a circle in the air. Nezha fell back, grinning despite the blood in his mouth. Li Jing advanced with the pagoda of the heavenly king on his palm and opened its light. The light bound and the staff struck at the binding until it cracked like ice under a thaw. The court called for a hunter who knew difficult game. Erlang Shen came with his hound and a quiet company of spearmen who did not waste words. The god of the third eye met the great sage on a ridge above the stables of heaven. The dog crouched, the wind steady. There was no speech between them. Erlang loosed the hound and the hound ran true. Wukong became a temple bell, and the hound bared its teeth at bronze. He became a cypress, and the spears hemmed the trunk. He became a gnat and vanished, and the third eye opened and found him. The chase ran across 7 terraces, and through 70 in 2 shapes, until both hunters were breathing hard, and the watchers had forgotten to cheer. In the end it was Laozi who turned the scale. The old master cast down a ring of hard light, and it struck the great sage on the head as he leapt and left him blinking. Nets fell, chains closed, the court exhaled. They took him to the 8 trigrams furnace and set him on the wind side where the flames were hottest. Laozi urged more air on the coals and closed the iron door. The alchemists counted the days, 77 by the old tally. They expected ash and a moral. When the door opened, the smoke rolled out, and with it the Monkey King, eyes red and bright as if a new sun had been lit behind them. The fire had failed to burn him. It had given him a gift. He could see the thin edges of things now. Glamour did not hold before that sight. Lies showed their seams. He picked up his staff from where they had locked it and stepped onto the terrace. The nearest guard ran, the rest followed. He did not waste time on ceremony. He lifted the iron and went to work. Pavilions tilted and fell. Flagstones buckled and flew. The Thunder Generals rallied and died well. Neja came again and fought like a friend might, earnest and without malice, and was thrown down a second time. The pagoda's light cracked once more. Banners trailed in the water of the celestial ponds. Carp scattered like sparks. By sunset, the courtyards looked like a map after a hard campaign. The Jade Emperor stood in a hall whose doors no longer closed true, and knew that what remained of pride would not save the roof. He could send for 1,000 more soldiers and win a steady ruin, or he could call a name that heaven rarely calls. He lifted his hand and gave the order that would empty the last cup of statecraft. Taibai Jingxing bowed and went west toward a mountain where thunder never leaves, and a calm face watches the world. Sun Wukong stood in the peach garden, among fallen fruit and torn branches, and listened to the silence that follows fear. He set the staff on his shoulder and smiled without joy. He had eaten heaven's peaches, drunk its wine, swallowed its pills, and survived its furnace. He had broken its armies and knocked on the doors of its pride. Now someone else would come. He did not know the name yet, only the weight of the air and the way the wind had started to move. He looked up at a patch of empty sky and felt for the first time how small even a great staff can seem. Taibai Jingxing rode the light west, while the palaces of high heaven still smoked and the carp ponds were choked with fallen banners. He passed beyond the star fields and the red dust of the mortal sky and came at last to the quiet that lives around Spirit Mountain. There the Thunderclap Monastery sits among slopes that never know decay. Pine and cypress hold their green through every age. Bells speak without hands to ring them. The air is very still, as if breath itself were listening. Taibai bowed to a hall that had no guards, and made his petition in a voice that did not dare to rise above a whisper. The courtyard filled with a presence that made his bones feel like reeds in the wind. The Tathagata did not stride or blaze. He arrived as a change in the weight of things. Shadows softened. The hard edges of fear wore smooth. When the old star was done speaking, there was no judgment on the great calm face, only a plain assent to what must be done. A sleeve turned like a wave. A soft step fell on no stone at all. In the next breath, the master of the West stood beneath the peach terraces of high heaven, while the last of the Thunder Generals gathered what courage they had left. Sun Wukong saw him, and smiled as a fighter smiles when a new opponent steps into the ring, and the crowd goes quiet. The Monkey King stood on a broken stair with the Ruyi staff across his shoulders and lacquer dust on his boots. He had eaten the peaches and drunk the wine. He had survived the furnace and split the ranks of heaven as if they were dry reeds. The Jade Emperor himself had sent for a judge from another court. That was a victory even before the first word was spoken. Buddha looked at the ruin without reproach. He looked at the soldiers without pity or pride. At last he looked at Sun Wukong, and in that gaze there was no flattery and no fear. He asked why the Monkey King sought the throne. Wukong answered in the easy voice of one who believes his own arithmetic: merit, strength, cunning. The court had mocked him, then tried to bind him with pretty titles, then tried to burn him alive. He had met every trial and remained standing. If heaven is a ladder, he had climbed more rungs than any peacock in a robe. Why should he bow to men who kept their places by habit alone? The Buddha listened as a teacher listens to a bold pupil. Then he spoke of limits, not the limits that small men use to make themselves feel large, but the true bounds that hold a universe together. Power can lift a mountain, he said, yet still be blind to the field it stands in. Cleverness can pick any lock, yet still not know what room it has entered. He did not raise his voice. He did not thunder. He suggested a test that would spare the soldiers more wasted courage. If the great sage could leap from the palm of his hand and go beyond it, the claim to the throne would be heard in earnest. If he could not, he would bend the knee and accept correction. Wukong laughed. It was not a cruel sound. It had the relief of a man who has been served the very dish he hoped for. He sprang to the Buddha's open hand. The skin was warm and unremarkable. The crease lines were plain as any farmer's, yet the space above them felt like a field that had not found its far fence. The Monkey King bent his knees, pressed cloud under his feet, and somersaulted. He flew past the last parapet and the roof tiles that still held the scent of smoke. He flew through a scattering of startled cranes. The sky opened like a road. He put 1,000 li behind him with every turn, and the turns came as often as a heartbeat when a warrior runs. Mountains shouldered up and fell away. Rivers unwound like silk. The corners of the world wheeled by and did not touch him. At last he came to the edge of things, or so it seemed, where a plain spread to a horizon that would not draw nearer, and 5 dark pillars stood like fingers of black stone scratching at the roof of the sky. He circled them once to mark their number. He landed on the tallest and walked its soot-glass face. He laughed again, because triumph tastes better when it is shared. He took out a brush, where a brush had no business being, and scratched his title on the pillar in a bold hand. Great sage equal to heaven. It looked well there. For an unkind parting gift he left a stain at the base, the sort of jest that seems clever to the victors of the hour. Then he sprang up, gathered cloud, and turned for home. The return was quicker, because victory shortens roads. He folded into the ruined court with the proud ease of a lord coming back from a hunt. The court moved as one body to watch him kneel on the great open palm and bow by a courteous inch. "I have been to the end of the world," he said, "and left my name there. You may go and see it when you have time." The Buddha nodded as if a child had finished a lesson. He lifted his hand. The lines of the palm were no longer only lines. They were canyons and ridges. There were 5 of them. At the tip of the middle ridge, in very small letters but still legible, were the words "Great Sage equal to heaven." At the base of the little finger there was a rude stain that no one wished to mention. The silence that followed was not the hush of awe. It was the inward quiet that comes when a boast is weighed and found wanting. The Monkey King looked at the letters and did not speak for a long breath. He had flown past mountains and a horizon that would not come near. He had written on what he thought was a pillar at the end of the sky. He stood in the same hand he had leapt from, the meaning folded into him like a blade sliding home. He hid the first ache of it with anger. He set his staff and made to strike the open palm, as if iron could bruise a truth this large. The Buddha did not move. The staff rang, and the ring went on a long time. Soldiers flinched at a sound that felt like it might shake the corners of the court loose. When the echo died, the hand was unchanged. The face was unchanged. Only the laughter had gone from the day. Wukong squared his shoulders and called for another trial with the stubborn courage that had carried him from waterfall to furnace. The Buddha inclined his head and answered that there would be one. It would not be the kind the Monkey King would have chosen. A wind rose where no storm had been. The light seemed to gather itself. The great calm hand turned, fingers spreading as if to set a seal. The great calm hand turned and the world turned with it. The terraces, the carved steps, the bright halls, all seemed to lean as if the sky itself had shifted its weight. Sun Wukong braced with the iron staff and found no leverage. A shadow like a mountain fell without sound. When it struck, the stones took the blow and cried out. Dust rose, then settled in a ring. Where Buddha's palm had been, there stood a peak with 5 ridges like fingers pressed into clay. Its flanks were veined with colours that told old names: green for wood, red for fire, yellow for earth, white for metal, black for water. Together they made a law that no cleverness could slip. They found him under the brow of that new mountain with the staff still in his hands. He heaved once and the peak did not notice. He became a dragon and the coils jammed against rock. He became smoke and smoke could not move stone. He became a flea and the weight was the same. He tried anger until it broke into breath. The earth around him shook and then went quiet. At last he lay still and listened to his own heart. The soldiers crept near and did not taunt him. Many had run before him that day and did not wish to tempt a change in fortune. They watched from a safe distance as the Buddha set a seal. It was a slip of paper with 6 true words written in a calm hand. He pressed it to the crown of the mountain, and the ink bled into stone as if the rock had thirsted for it. The words were not for sound, they were for weight. When the paper vanished, the mountain seemed to settle deeper into the earth. The Jade Emperor came from the broken banquet hall and bowed with the care of a man who has learned a lesson he does not enjoy. Courts do not often show gratitude to rescuers who reveal their weakness. Here there was no way to hide the debt. He thanked the Master of the West and made a speech about order restored. The Buddha answered with a nod and no triumph. He looked once more at the ruin and at the new peak, then gave instructions in a voice that did not rise. Leave the 5 elements mountain as it stands. Set a watch that is not cruel. Let the lesson ripen. When the time is right, a pilgrim will pass this way, and the seal will be taken for a better cause than punishment. He was gone before the echo left the terraces. The wind returned. The smell of dust and smoke lifted. Heaven began the long work of putting its halls back into the shape pride prefers. Banners were sewn. Flagstones were relayed. Clerks counted losses and produced lists, as if lists could wash a stain. Laozi stoked the triple furnace and said nothing. Neja laughed in the way. A good fighter laughs after a hard bout, and went to drill the troops so they would forget that a single iron staff had put them on their backs. Tai Bai Jinxing walked the peach garden and found fallen fruit among broken branches and wondered how many more bargains like this the court would be asked to make before it remembered that respect is cheaper than war. Beneath the mountain, the great sage counted time with the patience that comes when there is no other choice. The first days were a map of pain. His ribs knew the shape of granite. Pebbles ground against his knees. Ants made a road across his hand and did not hurry. He shouted once and the shout came back smaller. He saved his strength after that. Food and drink came on a cruel schedule. Earth spirits crept out of cracks with bowls of molten copper that steamed in the throat and iron pellets that sat like sorrow in the belly. He swallowed what he was given and learned that even a mouth as greedy as his could find no pleasure in survival. Seasons practiced their ancient craft upon him. Summer baked the stone until the air shimmered. Winter salted him with hoarfrost. Spring laid threads of green across the lower slopes and sent a ribbon of water past his cheek. Birds tried to nest in his fur until he shook them gently away. Lichens drew faint maps along the rock above his head. Sometimes rain found the right angle and ran into his mouth. Those were good days. He did not ask for pity and did not always refuse memory. When the pain was smaller, he let the mind walk. He followed it to the waterfall, behind which a nation of monkeys learned to keep their balance. He followed it to the cypress terrace where Subodhi had set a bruise on his brow and warned him that bright things attract stones. He followed it to the dragon palace and the feel of the iron when it first woke in his hand. He followed it to the furnace and the way the world looked when his eyes learned to see through trickery. He followed it to laughter that had seemed like victory and now sounded like a boy calling to friends across a field. The land gods learned to speak to him without fear. The old earth deity who kept the nearby village came often and brought him reports he had not asked for. The court was quiet. The river ran low that year. A caravan had been robbed 3 valleys away, and the magistrate had written a stern letter and done nothing. Once, the earth deity brought a message from the bodhisattva who keeps to the southern seas. She had passed in the form of a nun and left a small bundle of wild peaches by a shrine. The offering found its way to his lips. He ate them with care and did not speak. The bodhisattva's word was simple, and it was weightier than the mountain. Endure when the pilgrim comes. Be ready. 500 years is a time a man cannot hold in his head. It is a time a mountain understands. The peak settled by a finger's breadth. The slopes took terraces of grass. Children who had been told a story about a wicked monkey on the road to market became old and told the story in the same words and did not agree about the ending. The great sage learned a skill he had not prized. He learned to wait. The hot iron of his temper cooled by degrees. He did not forget his name. He did not forget the insult written into a banquet list. He did not forget that a throne that cannot share honor will always fear guests. He learned that anger is a poor shield when all that bears down upon you is the weight of what is. Once every long while a figure would come around the shoulder of the mountain with a bold stride and a loud voice and a talent for making promises. Foxes in a monk's robe, snakes who had taught themselves to walk like men. They offered bargains that ended with his bones in a stew pot or his head on a pike. He laughed at them and they went away. The better visitors brought silence and a prayer. He took those gifts and stored them with the peaches in a corner of himself that had not learned bitterness. There were nights when he dreamed. In one, the peach garden had grown over the white terraces and the court had to pick its fruit like common men. In another, the staff had turned to a mast and he sailed it across a dark sea. Most often he saw a path through a desert that did not end, and a single man walking it with the kind of stubborn hope that feeds on itself when all other fuel runs out. He woke from that dream with the taste of dust on his tongue, and knew that the time of waiting would not last forever. When at last the 5th century turned in its lock, The mountain shuddered as if it were settling into a new posture. A pilgrim had left the eastern capital with a royal edict and a clear heart. He had crossed bandit roads and narrow bridges. He had spoken with a goddess who liked to appear as a poor woman on a riverbank. He had been told that if he wished to bring light back to his land, he would first need a shadow to walk beside him. The Bodhisattva's plan had never been punishment alone. It had been a gate. Son, Wukong felt the first footfalls on the slope, as a fish feels the tug on a line. He kept his breath steady until the figure stepped into the small half-circle of shade where his face lay. A young monk looked up with eyes that had learned compassion the hard way. He carried no weapon. He carried a promise. He read the characters on the seal as if greeting an old friend. He spoke a few words that had been taught to him by a patient voice at the water's edge. The paper that had become stone softened like wax under a lamp and lifted. The weight pressed down for a last stubborn moment, then eased as if a hand had been taken from his throat. He stood slowly and the joints complained. He stamped once to remember what ground felt like when it moved with him. He bowed because some lessons had finally set. He did not promise obedience. He did not promise kindness. He promised service for a purpose larger than his pride. The monk nodded and gave him a name to use on the road, Disciple. The mountain watched them take the first steps together and did not speak. The capital of the great Tang sat like a jewel at the center of the plains. Walls as wide as rivers, gates that took a morning to count. Chang'an breathed order from the imperial way to the markets where spice and silk argued in the air. In the palace, Emperor Taizong held court with a calm that came from victory and the habit of command. He had made a nation from the broken swords of others. He trusted steel and accounts. He trusted omens a little more than he said. The year had been uneasy, a drought that was not quite a drought, a flood that ended too neatly, a sickness in the provinces that took the old and spared the young as if guided by a careful hand. The astrologers argued over their charts, and the Taoist adepts spoke of balances in need of repair. The Buddhists said that merit had fallen behind its debts. Then came a night that settled the matter. The emperor dreamed a river of black water and a palace after death, where clerks wrote with cold ink and dragon kings petitioned for justice. He woke with the taste of iron on his tongue and ordered rites for the forgotten dead. He wanted a clean line between his realm and whatever lay beyond the next breath. Courtiers filled the hall of state and each spoke for his own wisdom. The Confucians bowed and said that the law was enough if the law was applied with courage. The Taoists asked for more fasts and stricter offerings, and hinted that the court had grown soft before heaven. The monks of the Western teaching asked for compassion first and last, for compassion is the tool that disarms the wheel of suffering. The emperor listened to all and judged that each held a piece, and none held the whole. That was when a traveller came to court dressed as a poor pilgrim, though the attendants swore they had not seen her pass the gates. She bowed lightly and spoke in a voice that carried without effort. "The land needs light that does not burn," she said. "Send a seeker to the far west to bring true scriptures, the kind not yet heard in the east. There is no shame in learning from a neighbour when the lesson is good." She gave no name, but the ink of compassion was in her eyes, and Tai-bai Jing-sing, who knew the shapes that mercy takes, bowed deeper than a minister bows for any mortal. The emperor asked where such a seeker could be found. The pilgrim smiled and said he was already here. They brought a young monk from the great temple in the southern quarter. He had the courtesy of someone who has been told no and learned to accept it. His robe was worn at the knees. His hands were steady. His given name in the monastery was Xuanzang. He had studied sutra and commentary until the pages wore thin, and still he found questions whose answers were promised in the Sanskrit that had not reached Chang and in full. The abbots could see two things clearly. He would not be content without seeking the source. He would not survive a border without the emperor's seal. In a chamber where the murals showed lotus and cloud, the emperor spoke to the monk without ceremony. "The Tang should not be a house that keeps windows shut," he said. "Go west to the land where the Buddha taught. Go to the mountain where thunder speaks without thunder. Bring back the baskets of the teaching whole and uncut. I will write for you a letter that opens gates, and I will put the weight of my throne behind your empty bowl. This will not be a journey of days. It will not be a safe road." The court that had watched wars and tax seasons leaned forward to hear how a man with no sword would carry a charge that iron could not carry. There was debate even then. A senior minister, loyal in his own hard way, asked whether the empire could spare a learned man for a quest that promised stories rather than grain. A general with scars on his cheek wondered aloud what comfort scriptures would bring to a bandit's blade. The traveller in the plain robe said that there would be guardians for the road if the seeker had the courage to walk it. She did not say their names, but in her gaze there were mountains and a cave behind a waterfall, and a river where sand eats men, and a village that keeps a gate shut against a suitor with a pig face, and a white dragon waiting for a debt to be paid. The emperor weighed caution against promise, and remembered the dream of the Black River. He chose the promise. He signed an edict with Vermilion, and granted Xuanzang the title Sanzang, which is a Chinese name for Tripitaka, the keeper of the 3 baskets of scripture. He placed a travel pass in the monk's hands that commanded relay stations to supply food and mounts, and commanded border wards to let him through. He ordered a cassock woven of golden thread that shone without arrogance, and a bowl to beg with that reminded the proud that victory is a kind of hunger. He presented a staff with 9 rings that sang when shaken, a sound to warn small creatures from the path and to count the steps of compassion when days grow long. There were rites to mark the charge. The court knelt in the hall of great brightness, while monks chanted and Taoist flutes answered from the side halls, in a harmony that surprised them all. The emperor poured water on the floor before the steps, to make a river the monk could cross in safety. He spoke a promise that if the seeker returned with true sutras, the capital would build a tower for them, and the workmen would set each brick as if laying a prayer. The words were plain, the moment was not. Xuanzang left Chang'an at dawn with the city gate behind him and the empty bowl on his belt. The watchman on the wall called out the hour, and the sound fell across roofs and courtyards and into the kitchens of men who would never know his name. He went out through the western gate and into a country that grew wild by degrees. Relay stations gave him rice and a sleeping mat. County magistrates stamped his pass and wished him luck with the briskness of men who have little faith in luck. At the last garrison town, a captain of the frontier offered him an escort of 10 riders. Xuanzang thanked him and refused. A sword at your shoulder changes what you become. He walked on into wind that smelled of dust. The flat land gave way to hill and then to canyons where the sun comes late. He slept in monasteries where the monks had heard the edict and laid hot stones by his feet. He slept beneath tamarisk and woke with frost on his bowl. Some days he met caravans heavy with jade and fine wool, and they were polite and uninterested. Some days he met farmers who treated him as a moving blessing and gave him flatbread and tea and a story about weather that paid few debts. Once he saw a woman on a riverbank washing a child's clothes, and he felt a presence settle like a hand on the shoulder. The woman looked up, and her eyes were kind beyond their years. She spoke to him of the road ahead without moving her mouth. There will be guardians if you can keep to your vow. There will be tempters who wear the faces of the hungry and the faces of the noble. The strongest thread in a rope is not always the one you can see. At a desert outpost, where the last trees give up and the watchtowers look at each other across pale sand, he stood at the gate and felt the weight of what lay west. A soldier poured him water and made a joke about scholars who forget their way home. Xuanzang laughed with him, and then walked out into a world without landmarks. He counted breaths and steps, because numbers give shape when distances will not. He recited the Heart Sutra until the words began to feel like a road under the feet. He learned to hear the wind for the sound that means a dune will move tonight. He learned to recognize the crisp silence that means a scorpion sits under your blanket. In the long spaces he thought about the city he had left and about the court where men argue with courtesy and edged words. He thought about the traveller who had spoken for his cause and how the air had seemed to lean toward her when she spoke. He thought about the emperor who had believed that a bowl and a staff could carry as much honor as a sword. The thoughts were not heavy, they were steady. He walked beneath a sky that looked like the inside of a bell and let the sound of the rings on his staff count the heart of the day. On the far side of a range of broken teeth the land softened, and a road of packed clay found his feet. Village shrines began to appear again, each with a clay offering and a strip of red cloth that once had been bright. In one such shrine an old earth deity stared from his little house with a face cracked by 1,000 prayers. The god watched the monk pass and recognized a thread that had been woven long ago by a patient hand. He sent word along the lines that gods use, and the message ran fast. The pilgrim has entered the old game. Prepare the tests, prepare the guides. Twilight found Xuanzang at the foot of a mountain that did not look like other mountains. Its 5 ridges lay like fingers. Its shadow carried a weight that had nothing to do with stone. On the slope a footprint had worn a path where no herdsman travelled. The monk went up until the trees thinned and the rock stood bare and bright as bone. A seal had been set there in a script that did not fade. The words were as simple as a bell note. He read them once and felt the tenor of the world shift. A promise had come due. The seal lifted like wax from warm stone, and the mountain breathed. A scent came up that had not greeted daylight in 5 centuries. It was the dry sweetness of old lichen, and the iron of rock that has remembered a wait too long. Gravel slid. A hand rose from the dust with a staff in its grip, and then the rest of him came free, lean as rope, eyes bright as banked coals. Sun Wukong stood, stamped once to call his strength home, and looked upon the monk who had read the words and unbound the hill. The Monkey King had known many faces of power, dragons with jeweled brows, generals in iron, ministers whose smiles were traps. This man wore a patched robe and a travel bowl. His gaze had that quiet the sea shows in the hour before dawn. "You have a name," Wukong said. Xuanzang bowed. "The emperor calls me Sanzang. I am a seeker sent west." Wukong weighed the words, then inclined his head in return. a courtesy learned in a hard school. I am Sun Wukong, once a guest in heaven, at present on leave from a mountain. They did not waste speech. The slope was steep and the sun already near its fall. The old earth deity came creeping from his niche with offerings of spring water and a few wild peaches that no one had dared lay upon the rock before. Wukong ate with care and drank until his arms felt like his own again. The earth god told the monk what the bodhisattva had told him to tell. This one will walk with you if you give him a purpose larger than his pride. This one will need a curb, for his anger is an old habit, and habits are iron. That counsel had come earlier by another road. On a riverbank where reeds whispered, Xuanzang had met a woman in a plain robe whose eyes gathered light. She had pressed into his hands a thin gold circlet and a short chant written in a clear hand. This band will not look like itself until he wears it. Speak the words when the mind you borrow begins to run. Mercy sometimes walks with reins. So Xuanzang unwrapped the band from his sleeve and offered it with the calm that moves heavy things. A token from the southern seas, he said, a simple crown for the road. Wukong took it as a warrior takes a prize that suits his brow. He turned it in his fingers. The metal was warm already, as if it remembered foreheads. He set it above his ears, and the gold drank the light and closed like a ring of water. They began their descent and did not go far before the old world tried its old tricks. A gang of knife men had made a custom of watching that path. They saw the monk's bowl and his soft robe and the stranger with him who carried no visible baggage, and they stepped out with easy hunger. Wukong looked at Xuanzang as a soldier looks to a captain for rules. The monk tightened his mouth and said only this: "We do not seek quarrel. We do not allow injustice." The knife-men laughed and moved to take both. Wukong reached behind his ear and drew black iron into the length of a mast. He did not roar or boast. He walked forward, and the first man in his way became a shape on the ground that would not move again. The others had enough sense to scatter, but not enough to outpace him. He swept the road clean in the time it takes a pot to boil. When it was done, Xuanzang stood very still, the rings on his staff faintly answering one another. He said a prayer for the fallen and for the one who had struck them down. They went on until a bend in the trail gave them a view of the plain. There Wukong found that his victory had left a familiar itch. He twirled the staff with a flourish because the arm remembers what it enjoys. The monk spoke the chant he had been given in a voice no louder than the wind in grass. The band about Wukong's brow tightened like a fisherman's line taking a pull. Pain lit his skull white and sure. He dropped the staff and clawed at the ring. "We had an agreement," he snarled through his teeth. "We have a vow," Xuanzang answered, "and vows are not bargains. You asked for a purpose larger than your anger. I ask for a guard whose strength serves mercy first." Wukong reached again for the circlet and found that his fingers could not find a seam. He tried to pull it off and it became smaller. He let his hands fall and waited until the heat in his head cooled to a manageable throb. Then he bowed, not low but real. "You have your rope, master. Do not pull it except when the cart needs it." The rings on the pilgrim's staff clicked once, like the tongue of a lock. Xuanzang nodded. "I will pull when you forget who you are walking beside." They camped that night beneath stunted pines at the edge of a pasture. The earth deity brought news in the dark, as gods who keep to their small charge prefer to do. Spirits along the road had already learned that a monk walked with a guardian. Some had sharpened teeth at the thought of monk flesh. Some had sharpened schemes. Guanyin's name went before them like a lantern that deflects the moths that know better and draws the ones that do not. Toward midnight, a woman in rags came to the edge of the firelight and asked for a sip from the kettle. She had the posture of a beggar and the wrists of a court dancer, and her eyes hid a glimmer that Wukong knew from long practice. He asked her name and she gave 3. He asked her village, and she pointed 3 ways. He did not strike her. He plucked a hair and blew on it, and the hair became a small Wukong who walked around the woman in a slow circle and sniffed. Then he bowed to Xuanzang, a fox who has learned to wear a face, harmless if kept hungry, cruel if fed. The monk gave the woman a cup of hot water and a heel of bread and sent her on. The fox bowed with dignity and left them their sleep. Under the pines, Wukong said nothing, but in the morning his manner had shifted. He walked half a pace behind the monk and half a pace to the side, where a bodyguard can move without hindering and can kill without brushing a robe. Over the next days he learned the rhythm of the vow. When a village asked for help with a drunk who beat his sister, he set the man face down in the dust and kept his staff from the skull. When a river spirit tried to pull the pilgrim from a ford, he broke the spirit's grip and let it crawl back to its stones. Twice he flared, and twice the band bit him until the world went white and then grey. He began to feel the moment when his temper would leap the fence, and he learned to call it back. It is a hard thing for a warrior to discover that the curb is part of the horse. On the 5th day they came to a crossroads shrine, where a pot of ashes smouldered, and a strip of red cloth had faded to a gentle brown. A nun waited there who had the look of travellers who somehow are never tired. She poured tea that steamed even though no fire burned. The bodhisattva does not always linger in form, but when she does, the world leans in to hear. Guanyin looked at the gold on Wukong's brow, and at the mark it had left beneath the skin. Her smile was not unkind. This ring is not iron, great sage. It is the shape of your vow. Remove the vow and the ring will go with it. Keep the vow and you will forget the ring is there. Then she turned to Xuanzang and spoke with the gentleness reserved for stubborn men. He will save your life and endanger it. He will terrify your enemies and distress your friends. He is the right companion because he is the hardest to keep. Wukong bowed lower to her than he had to any save his first master. If I bring the monk to the western paradise whole, will I have paid what I owe? You will have paid some, she said. You will understand the rest without asking. She set a rosary of plain beads in Xuanzang's hand and told him to recite the chant only when the line must hold. She set her palm briefly upon Wukong's head, and the band warmed without pain. Then she was a traveller again, with dust on her hem, and walked down the road as if she had always been part of it. They took the western track, where the clay ruts hold the prints of caravans and the hedges show the marks of hungry goats. Farmers waved. Children ran to the roadside and stared at the monkey with wide eyes and then laughed when he frowned at them. In the late light of that day, when the fields had given way to scrub and the ground sloped toward a river that spoke under its breath, Xuanzang stopped and lifted the bowl that had seen more sky than soup. He asked a simple question. Will you walk with me to the end of the world and back? Wukong rested the iron staff on his shoulder and looked at the horizon as if he were weighing the distance in his palm. I will walk with you until the sea gives you back to the emperor and the emperor calls you saint, and afterward, if there is still road, I will break what needs breaking and I will spare what can be spared. I will not promise to be gentle. I will promise to be true. They set out again, and the evening folded around them with the easy welcome of a land that has always belonged to travellers. The 5 Elements mountain dwindled behind them by a finger's width with every mile. Ahead lay Gao village and the river that swallows men, and a white dragon who owed a debt, and the first of many nights when the band would remind a warrior that there is more than victory to be learned. The road tilted down out of rough country into fields that looked well managed by men who had learned to coax good harvests from stubborn soil. Willow hedges marked the edges of paddies and footpaths. Irrigation ditches ran straight as a magistrate's line. Toward noon they came to a market where the fishmonger's stall had been turned over recently and put to rights in a hurry, and where the gossip of a dozen doorways seemed to circle one name without speaking it aloud. Gao village had the air of a place that had seen a bandit on its lane and pretended not to notice because the bandit came every night for supper. When Xuanzang asked for a bowl of water at a shade tree, old men with sun-broken faces gave it quickly and added small courtesies that come only when people want something larger than a thank you. The earth deity of that place, a little god with a bronze face blackened by years of incense smoke, leaned out of his shrine and tried not to stare at the gold band on Wukong's brow. The god had heard that a monk and a guardian were on the road. He had also heard that Squire Gao, the richest man in 3 counties, had lost his peace to a creature that could not be bought with silver. They found the squire behind a gate that had been patched twice and braced with a beam of cedar. He was a man with a farmer's shoulders who had learned the taste of authority late and wore it carefully, as if a wrong step might spill it. His daughter Quilan stood at his side with downcast eyes, and a household of servants drifted on the edges of the room like shadows who had been told to hold their breath. The story came in pieces at first, because men who have been shamed do not tell the whole at once. A labourer had been hired in a year of floods, a great fellow with a face like a friendly thunderhead and strength that made work look easy. He had a taste for wine and a way with a rake that kept the ditches clear in half the usual time. He spoke in a slow country voice and flattered the squire by calling him Lord of the Soil. Then the man had shown his true appetite. He drank too much, ate like a wolf, slept through dawn, and in short order declared that the master's daughter had been promised to him. When the squire protested, the labourer laughed, lifted a wagon by its axle to prove his right, and settled in as if he were already a son of the house. The gate was barred after that, but he came and went as he pleased, walking through walls like mist when it suited him. They tried prayers and charms and a hired swordsman whose sword bent like tin when it touched the intruder's shoulder. The village called the thing Pigsy when it dared to speak at all, a name shaped by fear and anger both. The old god said a better name would come only when the man himself remembered it. Son, Wukong stood with his iron staff grounded and asked simple questions until the account ran to its end. What did he eat? How did he move in the night? What weapon did he carry? The squire said that Pigsy kept a muck rake with 9 teeth on it, and that the tool had picked up a temper it had not had when it was used on honest ditches. Wukong's mouth crooked at that. Only a certain sort of memory makes a man keep a rake for a spear. He asked if the intruder had shown a taste for the sacred or a fear of it. The squire admitted that the man bowed easily and spoke the name of the Queen Mother with a countryman's reverence, but mocked the local magistrate as if the law were a table dog. Xuanzang listened and said little. He looked once at the daughter, who stood straight and did not tremble, and gave her the smallest nod a monk can give to courage without shaming it. They laid a plan that used honesty for its bait. Word would go out that the squire had relented. The wedding would be held at dusk. The household would weep and sing as custom demanded. Pigsy would come grinning to the gate with his rake over his shoulder, and he would pass into a courtyard where the bride waited with her veil down and her hands folded. If the veil slipped, it would be at the right moment. If the hands unfolded, they would close around Iron. The afternoon slid by with the slow purpose of a snake seeking shade. When the sun was low, the courtyard lamps were lit, and the gate opened wider than it had in months. Neighbours gathered outside with the sideways look of people who mean to see and not be seen. Inside, the squire sat rigid on his chair and watched the doorway where his fate would enter. Music began. It was not good music. It was the brave sort that men play when their fingers do not want to obey. A heavy step fell in the lane. The gate shook as a great shadow shouldered through. He was taller than any man in the room, and broader, with a face that had once been handsome in a rough way and now had a snout stubbornness laid over it like a mask. His ears had a softness to them that did not come from any human mother. His little eyes shone with pleasure at his own audacity. He bowed to the squire in a parody of courtesy and leaned his rake against a pillar. "My father," he said, and the word made the servants flinch. The bride stood still as a post. Pigsy reached for the veil, and her hand came up as if to guide him. At that touch she changed. Silk fell away from a grin no mortal maid has ever worn. The small figure in red was suddenly a lithe monkey with a crown of gold that drank the lantern light, and the hand that had seemed delicate closed on a staff that lengthened as it rose. Pigsy snatched for his rake and got it in time by a breath. Iron teeth met iron bar, and sparks ran like beetles. The first exchange rattled the rafters. The second shattered a lantern and sent oil across the stones. Servants threw water from buckets that were far too small for what they had just seen. The squire did not move. He had put his feet on the reality of the thing and could not lift them. The fight ran through the courtyard and out across the paddock where a cooking shed stood near the wall. Wukong pressed and Pigsy gave ground with a skill that came from earlier days in a different uniform. The muck rake is a farmer's tool, but in the right hands it becomes an argument the world listens to. He hooked, he swept, he broke grips with the quick twist of a wrist that remembers parade drills. Wukong answered with footwork learned under cypress shade, and a rod that could be as light as a wand or as heavy as a beam. The rake caught the staff once and held it. Pigsy's small eyes lit with hope. Wukong let the staff shrink in his hands to slip the teeth, and then swell again in time to ring Pigsy's helm with a blow that dropped him to one knee. The big man grunted and laughed through blood. "I have not had a dance partner in a long while. Shall we turn once more?" They turned twice and 3 times. The last turn took them through the cooking shed wall in a storm of splinters. The villagers outside cheered without meaning to and then clapped hands over their mouths. Wukong kicked the rake aside at last and set the iron across Pigsy's throat. He could have ended it with the weight of his arms. He looked instead to Xuanzang, who had followed at a measured distance with the rings on his staff, speaking softly to the night. The monk knelt where the light fell across the defeated face. He saw the shape under the shape. The broad brow had once been the brow of a marshal. The hands that had clutched at women and wine had once set a standard in order before dawn. The snout had been earned by appetite, but the eyes still knew command. Xuanzang spoke quietly, not to shame the man but to make him remember. You are not Pigsy. That is what fear calls you. You were once Tian Peng, marshal of the water armies, who lost a post for a folly and fell to earth into a pig womb. You have a choice. Continue as you are and end as meat in a hunter's smokehouse. Or stand, put your head to the ground, and ask to serve a cause bigger than your belly. Pigsy stared up at the staff and then passed it at the monk's face. He could smell the honesty in those words the way a boar smells water under sand. He took a breath that shuddered. The muscles in his jaw loosened. He put his head down on the stones. The gesture was not graceful. It was real. In that moment the courtyard changed. The night air softened. A presence that had been watching from the edge stepped closer and did not need to be seen to be known. Guanyin had no need to stand in sight to seal a vow. Her voice came as warmth on the back of the neck. Your name is not a joke given by frightened men. Take the name Zhu Wuneng, the boar who awakens to power, and travel in the company of the scripture seeker. Work will teach you what pleasure has not. A tremor ran through the great body, and the pig's snout seemed a shade less proud of itself. He rose and bowed again. The bow had the awkwardness of a soldier who has forgotten drill, and it was better for that. He turned to the squire and to Kui Lan and offered an apology that stumbled but did not fall. The squire nodded once and let out a breath he had not known he was holding since spring. The daughter lifted her eyes and met the new disciple's gaze for the first time, as if seeing a neighbor at last where a nightmare had stood. They did not make a feast of it. The household set out bowls of millet and a thin soup, and the 4 travellers ate at a long bench with steam lifting around their faces. Zhu Wuneng needed 2 bowls, and then a third. Wukong watched him over the rim of his own, and said nothing until the 4th. Then he tapped the new disciple's wrist with the tip of the iron staff. You will learn to be hungry and happy. It is possible. I have done both. Before dawn, the house woke to a quiet it had not known in months. The gates stood open for the first time since the first boast had been spoken in that courtyard. The squire walked them to the road and pressed a packet of rice into Xuanzang's hands, then into Wukong's, then into Zhu Wuneng's. He tried to press one into the hands of the tall, silent man who carried the luggage and kept to the edge of the lamps, and found there was no one there. Sha Wujing would come to them on another river. They took the western track as the first birds began to insist on being heard. Wukong walked a little ahead, staff on his shoulder, eyes easy but sharp. Zhu Wuneng swung his rake with an air of pride that had softened into something like purpose, and when he fell into old jokes that tasted of wine and women, he stopped himself with a visible effort that made Xuanzang smile without showing teeth. The village fell away behind them, and the land opened into a plain where the map promised a river that had no patience for boats. The road bent toward it like a reed drawn to a current. There would be another guardian waiting, and a white dragon who had a debt to pay. The road ran flat and featureless for a long morning, and then the world simply ended. Before them stretched a river that did not behave like a river. Wind raised ripples that moved against the current. The surface shifted in long bruised bands from slate to the colour of old blood, and every few breaths the water seemed to swallow itself and settle again a handspan lower. The locals called it the Flowing Sands. The older maps named it Liusha, the river of shifting kill. Along the near bank lay the proofs of that name, ribs clean as horn, skulls polished to a dull pearl by grit and time, Someone had bound 9 of those skulls together with rawhide and hung them from a tamarisk as a warning or a boast. A ferry had once worked this reach. Its posts were there still, leaning out of the mud like teeth from a broken jaw. The boat was gone, the ferryman too, if the pile of bones on the far spit told the truth. Xuanzang stood very still, with the rings of his staff answering one another in a nervous whisper. Chu Wuneng spat once into the dust and peered up and down the shore for a ford that did not exist. Sun Wukong stepped to the water and tasted it on a finger and found too much salt for a river and too much dust for a sea. He told the others to keep back from the edge. A thing that eats ferrymen is content to wait for monks. Late in the day the river moved. It was not only wind. The drift of the surface lifted with intent, and from that heave rose a figure taller than a gate, with skin the colour of river clay and a mouth like a wet wound. He wore a string of skulls across his chest, the way a gentleman wears fine jade. In his hands was a staff whose ends flared to a crescent blade, the weapon of temple wardens turned into the tool of a man who had forgotten temples. He spoke with a voice that had learned to echo in caverns. The monk will come into the water. The flesh of a scripture seeker will harden a demon's bones. Zhu Wuneng lifted his rake and set his feet. Wukong only tapped his iron rod on the ground once and asked for a name. The ogre's eyes narrowed as if memory were a splinter under the skin. He said that once he had stood in heaven and lifted the curtain for imperial audiences. He had broken a crystal goblet at the peach banquet, and the court had fallen on him like a pack of dogs. For his clumsiness, the ninefold blades had whipped his back by day and night until mercy ran out, and then they had cast him down to the river that eats men. He had learned to make a feast of pilgrims, because the river is patient and hunger is not. The string of skulls clicked against one another, as if remembering names. The first rush was a lesson in weight. The sand itself rose in sheets to blind the eyes and turned footing to treachery. Wukong slid sidewise and met the crescent with the middle of the staff, feeling the shock through both arms. Zhu Wuneng charged in with a roar and found his rake caught and turned like a toy. The ogre fought with a grim economy that spoke of old drill and the long practice of regret. He drove them from the waterline with strokes meant to break ribs. Xuanzang had taken 3 steps into the shallows before Wukong shouted him back, and in those 3 steps the hem of his robe had gathered a red stain that did not wash out. They gave ground to the tamarisk and found nothing there but bones and wind. The ogre came on with his skulls knocking and the blade whistling, and he would have pushed them into the sand and fed the river. Another story if a scent of lotus and clean rain had not moved across the bank like the memory of spring. The air became a little lighter. A plain-clothed nun stood where there had been only ripple and glare, and her eyes made the world hush. Guan Yin did not raise her hand. She asked the ogre if his back still remembered the knives. She asked him if the river had taught him anything that punishment had not. The great head bowed, once, and his voice, when it came, had the roughness of a man who has not spoken his own name in a very long time. The Bodhisattva said that a pilgrim had indeed come, and that there was still a ledger that could be corrected if the ogre would put down the habit that had made his hands famous along this bank. "Take a new name," she said, "for the old names you have been called are not fit for the work ahead. Take the name Sha Wujing, the sand who awakens to purity, and walk beside the scripture seeker with humility where once you stood before an emperor with pride." The staff lowered. The long body seemed to sag as if the river were paying back weight it had lent. Sha Wu-jing put his forehead to the mud and stayed there as the water lapped at his ears. He rose and did not look at the skulls when he unknotted the cord and let them fall. Xuanzang blessed him without flourish, and Wukong watched the set of the ogre's shoulders as one soldier watches another return to the line after punishment. Zhu Wuneng reached out a hand halfway and then pretended to scratch his chin when he remembered modesty. They tied a rope of plaited reeds. Wu Jing stepped into the water and braced himself as a bridge. The current tugged like a stubborn mule. One by one they crossed with packs and staff and pride held high. On the far bank the river gave a shudder as if marking a change and settled to its work again, indifferent as always. They did not get far before the debt of an earlier promise came due. A white mane flashed low over the reeds, and an elegant head lifted above the water with curiosity sharpened into hunger. It was a dragon in the shape of a horse, and it had the cheerful malice of a prince who has never had his nose bloodied. It took 2 running steps on the water and seized the pilgrim's horse by the neck and shook until the poor beast was only a memory. Then it turned on the company with bright eyes and the quick breath of a creature that expects to have its way. Wukong welcomed the fight. He leapt, and the staff came down and a wave rose to meet it. The dragon bucked and flicked the iron aside with a snap of its neck and a twist of a body made for a different kind of sky. Xu Weneng waded in and found his rake useless against that slick hide. Sha Wujing moved to guard Xuanzang and planted his crescent blade in the mud like a banner. The white creature laughed, and the laugh had a courtier's polish under its wildness. It darted forward to nip at the monk as if teasing a servant, and Wukong hit it on the crown hard enough to make the reeds tremble. That took the smile away. They would have broken it by force and paid for victory with a cracked skull or 2 if mercy had not arrived early for once. The same scent of lotus came up, this time with a sharper note of displeasure. The bodhisattva stepped onto the bank, and the dragon froze as if winter had settled around its legs. She spoke the beast's story in a few unadorned lines. A son of the West Sea's Dragon King, a pearl cracked by arrogance and a hall set on fire. An execution stayed at the last moment by a promise to wait on this very reach and atone by carrying a holy man to the west. Waiting had turned to idleness, and idleness to mischief, and mischief to the habit of eating what wandered close. She named him Ao Li so that he would remember he had a father and a house that would only take him back if he learned to bow. The dragon prince made a show of standing tall and then sagged like a boy learning the value of an apology. Guan Yin tapped her willow branch against the air, and the elegant head shrank and the long body shortened, and what stood there was a white horse of unusual grace, with a look in its eye that promised opinions. Xuanzang bowed and thanked the bodhisattva for keeping a bargain he had not known he was part of. Wukong patted the new mount once on the neck and leaned close enough to be heard. "Eat any more of our horses, and I will ask to ride you bareback until the western paradise." They left the river with their company full grown at last. Sun Wukong walked ahead where the road narrowed and bent. Juvuneng trudged in the middle and learned the trick of carrying burdens while making jokes that did not always need to land. Sha Wujing took the rear where his silence kept the curious from coming too near, and his crescent blade looked like an argument not worth having. The white dragon horse carried the monk with a dignity that bordered on wounded pride, and learned to lower his head for small bridges and prick his ears at bandit whistles. Above them the sky opened in a wide strip of blue, and ahead the land bunched itself into low hills and wooded gullies, where white bone learned her tricks, and a pilgrim learned how hard it is to tell mercy from delusion. White Tiger Ridge did not look like a place where faith would fail. The slopes were soft with grass, and the wind moved in long, clean strokes through a stand of pines. A brook came down in silver threads and broke across stone where children had once played at boats. Yet the land carried a silence that did not belong to birds or weather. The old earth deity of that stretch had retreated into his shrine and pulled the incense curtain tight, and travellers took the long way round without admitting why. Xuanzang felt it in the way the rings on his staff barely answered one another. Xu Wuneng felt it in his appetite, which went quiet for the first time since Gao village. Sha Wujing said nothing and watched the shadows as if they might change without the sun moving. Sun Wukong lifted his face and sniffed the air as a hound does when the brush is thick and a boar holds still. They found the first figure where the ridge fell to a meadow. A village girl stood among the wild pears with a basket on her hip. She was thin in a way that made pity rise in the throat, with dust on her feet and a smile that made her look younger than her years. She offered fruit to the monk and bowed as if to a shrine. The flesh was cool and sweet, and the girl spoke of a mother who waited in a hut nearby and would be honored to feed a holy man and his companions. Xuanzang blessed her and reached for a pear. Sun Wukong did not move. He had learned a gift from the furnace of Laozi that gave a cost to the lesson. His eyes had been burned clear. Glamour tore like cheap silk before him. He looked and saw a white glare under the girl's skin and heard a whisper that did not belong in any human throat. The basket held more than pears. He stepped between monk and maiden and spoke without heat. "You will not feed him." The girl blinked and tilted her head. He brought the iron staff up and down in a stroke that would have broken a yoke. The body fell and rolled once in the grass. Where a girl had been, there lay a heap of clean bones that gave off the faint smell of winter. Xuanzang cried out and sprang forward, but Wukong barred him with the staff and pointed. As the monk watched, the bones flickered and were gone, and the grass held an ordinary corpse with blood in its sleeve and the slack look of a peasant dead too soon. Xu Wuneng stepped back with a curse and a hand to his mouth. Sha Wujing stood like a post in a flood and did not blink. The sound that followed was not grief, it was outrage. Xu Wuneng found a voice first. "Master," he said, "you saw him strike a child. The villagers will smell this blood and come with ropes." He swung his rake toward Wukong without meaning to, and then caught himself with an effort. Xuanzang looked from the body to his guardian, and his face went white with a disappointment that hurt worse than anger. The Monkey King met his eyes for a long count. He spoke in a voice he kept for hard truths. This was not a girl, it was Bai Gujing, a demon that wears what men love and fear to hide its hunger. She wants your flesh because it is the kind that turns monsters into saints. If they can keep it down, she will try again. They moved on because there was no choice. The ridge narrowed and the path turned along a shoulder where scrub hid the drop. Toward noon they saw a bent figure ahead, a mother with grey hair and a stick, calling a daughter's name in a voice that pulled at the chest. She asked for help and for news of a child with a pear basket. Xuanzang stepped forward to speak, but Wukong was already moving. The iron staff came down and the old woman fell like a robe dropped to the floor. For a heartbeat, the body was bones glowing faint as milk. Then the bones were gone, and there was a human corpse with skin that had known 70 winters. The wind took a breath through the pines. Xuanzang said the spell for restraining a disciple and bit it off before the word reached its end. The gold band on Wukong's brow warmed and cooled like a coal that chooses to wait. Zhu Wuneng spoke in the sour tone of a man who expects to be ignored and hopes to be obeyed. "Master," he said, "I carry your burdens and I would never counsel you against mercy, but this is murder in daylight. He kills old women while we stand and watch. The squire at Gao village gave us his trust, and we did not break it. These hills have given us nothing, and he repays them with blood." Sha Wujing did not speak, but the set of his shoulders said he would put himself between staff and monk if the air changed wrong. They climbed again, 2 parts fear and 1 part stubbornness, and the land folded into a valley where a house squatted among low terraces. An old man waited at the door with a face like tanned leather and eyes that watered from grief. He said that his wife and daughter had gone to pick pears and had not returned. He begged the monk to bless the house and to eat before he went on. The pots simmered. Steam rose with the scent of meat. Hunger is a true thing. Zhu Wuneng shifted his weight toward the door before he knew he had moved. Xuanzang laid a hand on his sleeve and felt the heat of the man's shame under pigskin. Sun Wukong stepped across the threshold as a judge steps onto a bench, not because he likes the seat, but because it is his to take. He struck, and the old man died without finishing the small gasp that had begun in his throat. There was no corpse on the floor. There was a white skeleton with a skull that still carried a grin that was no human grin at all. The house shuddered, and its corners bowed inward. The pots went to powder, and the steam turned into a stink that stabbed at the eyes. The valley rang with a laugh from nowhere and everywhere at once. The laugh had hunger in it and pleasure at having baited the hook so cleanly. Bai Gujing spoke in a voice that rode the wind. "I will take the monk when night comes. He will bless my ribs from the inside." The light on the ridge dimmed by a finger's worth, as if a cloud had passed and found a place to stop. Xuanzang's hands were shaking as he gripped the rings of his staff. He did not look at the skeleton. He looked at Wukong and tried to find the companion who had fought a child of the Bull King without gloating and had spared a drunk when a skull would have made an easier lesson. He found a warrior with iron in his gaze and patience worn thin by a game that had no rules. The monk's voice when it came was quiet, because that is how a man speaks when a bond starts to tear. "You ask me to trust your eyes against what my own tell me. You ask me to bless bones that have faces I can name. I cannot bless this." Wukong rested the staff across his shoulders and did not bow. He had taken the blows of gods and the weight of a mountain. Words still found the gaps in his guard. He said what he could. "I am your eyes where yours are tempted. I am your hands where yours will not strike. If I let her live, you die, and the road ends. She will come again when you are alone. She will bring better tears and a better smile. I will not give her a 4th chance." They left the valley under a sky that had grown hard. The path bent through scrub grass and across a ridge of pale stone. Not far ahead stood the mouth of a cave that breathed cold air from deep chambers. In the shadow under the lip, something moved with the slow care of a hunter who knows the ground. Wukong took the lead and did not look back. The others followed in a silence that turned their footfalls into accusations. When the wind shifted, they caught a smell like old bone and wet ash. Bai Gujing had not fled far. She was close and patient, and now she knew how to speak in voices that would turn the monk's heart against the hand that guarded him. By the time the sun had flattened itself on the western hills, trust had worn thin as thread. The demoness waited with one last mask ready, and a plan for the hour when cold creeps into a man's courage. The knight would ask a price from more than one vow. The company made a small camp within sight of the cave because there was no place else to stand. Xuanzang prayed by the light of a twig fire and found little peace. Zhu Wuneng muttered into his blanket and sharpened the teeth of his rake. Sha Wujing sat where he could see the cave and the monk and the place where Wukong lay with his face to the dark. The Monkey King watched the stars that had taught him the measure of distance and waited to be judged for telling the truth with a bloody stick. Night settled over White Tiger Ridge with a clean cold that made the small fire seem like a candle before a storm. The cave breathed as if some great lung worked deep inside the hill. Xuanzang sat with the rings of his staff ticking softly in the dark and tried to settle his mind. Zhu Wuneng sharpened the tines of his rake on a flat stone that had seen this ritual many times before. Sha Wujing kept his back to the fire and his face to the cave. The son Wukong lay with one arm under his head and watched the stars through a gap in the branches, counting them without moving his lips, a habit learned beside a furnace that had burned the lies out of his eyes. The last mask came an hour after moonrise, a tremor of footsteps, and then a voice that could have broken a better man than any of them. It was the voice of a father calling a son to the door. An old man tottered into the firelight with a staff and a bundle, and the careful bow of someone taught respect before ambition. He wept when he saw the monk and told a story about a family ruined by a demon and a daughter who had fallen by the road while bringing pears to a shrine. He showed a charm written in a familiar hand and begged for a blessing. Xuanzang rose because the body stands before the mind can catch it when grief speaks that way. Wukong was already moving. The iron staff rose and fell exactly once. The old man dropped like a robe with no bones inside it. The fire kicked and hissed. For a breath, there was only a white glare of bone, long fingers like the ribs of an umbrella, a skull that smiled without lips. Then the bones dissolved and a peasant corpse returned, ordinary and obscene by being ordinary. The silence that followed was not awe. It had the edge of a rope pulled past patience. Xuanzang stood with his hands shaking. Zhu Wuneng said aloud what fear had been whispering. "Master, we have become accomplices to a butcher. He kills children and elders, and now he kills fathers before our fire." Sha Wujing put one hand on the monk's elbow and the other on the shaft of his own blade, and said nothing. Wukong faced the three and let the anger pass through him like surf against rock. He spoke plain. This was Bai Gujing. She will not wear another face. She is finished. We can sleep. Xuanzang did not sleep. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stood with the knight on his shoulders. When he came back, he had decided. He called the disciple by his name, and Wukong came because he always came when the monk used that tone. Xuanzang spoke the words he had been taught beside a river where the reeds never break and the water never argues. The tightening spell climbed the gold band like heat rising up a column and closed on the skull. Wukong went to one knee as if the ground had been taken from him. The pain was clean and without mercy. He put both hands to the ring and could not find the seam that had never been there. He looked up through it at the only man he had agreed to obey. Xuanzang's voice was steady, because a steady voice is sometimes all a man has. "You saved my life by a hair. You have put me in danger with the same hand. I cannot see what you see, and I cannot travel with a guardian who kills what looks like my people. Go back to the mountain you came from. Find your throne and your laughter. This road does not need your iron." The Monkey King stood, because pride is a bone that holds a back in place when everything else fails. He did not beg and he did not bow. He picked up the staff and set it behind his ear as if it were a needle. He looked at Zhu Wuneng and Sha Wujing and found there no hatred, only fear and relief, and a reluctance that tasted of shame. He looked once at the monk who had freed him from a stone hand and now bound him with a few true words. Then he stepped into the trees and was gone. The night filled the space where he had been as if it had been waiting for that very place to be empty. 2 days later, a quiet country turned sharp. The road bent toward a small state where the local lord had a taste for hunting and a taste for pretty words that excused cruelty. His household had been in thrall for a season to a guest whose robes were rich and whose face was a little too smooth for a man of years. That guest called himself Yellow Robe, and he ruled his host without needing a title. He had servants who moved like moths in daylight and soldiers who never quite met your eyes. He smelled the monk miles away as a wolf smells warm blood in snow. His men raised a shrine as bait and hung out a kindness for travellers. When Xuanzang stopped to bless the altar, nets dropped and ropes tightened, and iron that had been waiting all morning did its work in an instant. Zhu Wuneng and Sha Wujing fought as men fight when failure will shame them more than death, but they were driven back by a sorcery that ate strength the way the flowing sands eats boats. The monk was carried into a cave cut into the belly of a low hill and locked in irons that grew warm if you prayed too long. Yellow Robe watched his prize with satisfaction that he did not bother to hide. He sent a polite note to the magistrate that explained in careful calligraphy why the monk must remain a guest of the state until certain ceremonies were complete. He sent a less polite message to the countryside by hanging 3 captives at a crossroad with paper charms pasted over their mouths. Zhu Wuneng made 2 attempts to break the cave and learned the cost of trying to uproot a stone with bare hands. Sha Wujing found the exits and discovered that the exits were not meant for men who breathe. The 2 met after the second failure and looked at each other like soldiers who have used every tool in the cart. Zhu Wuneng said the only thing left to say: "I will fetch him. He will not come. He will come if I ask him right." Flower Fruit Mountain received the prodigal as it receives storms and spring and tax collectors. The monkeys cheered and laid fruit at the feet of the throne. Wukong let them and sat and tried to feel the ease that had always come as soon as the water curtain cave closed behind him. It did not come. The cave sounded wrong. The laughter sounded thin. The iron staff leaned where it had always leaned and looked like a question. When Zhu Wuneng walked into the hall without ceremony and without fear, the court went quiet because the court had learned that confidence makes kings listen. The boar knelt because humility makes kings change their minds. He told the story in plain strokes. Xuanzang in irons, a demon with good manners and a better cave, a village that would remember their shame if the monk's bones were found in a pot. He did not flatter and he did not beg. He ended with a sentence that tasted like truth. You can stay and be right, or you can come and be needed. Wukong threw his cloak aside and stood before the echo had finished saying needed. He did not ask permission from the mountain because mountains do not ask permission from him. He and Zhu Wuneng rode a cloud west as if they had been born to it. They reached the hill where Yellow Robe kept his house and found a gate that smiled with teeth. Wukong went in alone because 1 knife is easier to hide than 2. He used an old trick learned in palaces where servants carry power and masters carry vanity. He plucked a hair and became a moth on a torch ring and watched the changing of the guards until the pattern showed its weak stitch. He slipped into the kitchens and poured a sleeping draught into a pot of wine that waited in a cool alcove for a lord's midnight thirst. Then he walked into the hall as a minor demon with a bent back and clever hands, and offered to rub the master's shoulders until the wine made his head heavy. Yellow Robe slept and dreamed of a throne that did not exist. Wukong made of himself a small thing and ran along roof beams and corridors and down a stair that had not been used in a season. He found Xuanzang sitting with his eyes open and his breath steady, as men breathe when they have found the bottom of fear and set a chair there. He warned the monk to be very quiet, and he snapped the iron with a twist that would have broken a lesser wrist. They reached the stair before the guards woke. They reached the courtyard before the drum sounded. They reached the outer gate as the first ranks formed. Wukong would have fought there and made a tale of it. Zhu Wuneng opened a way with a blow of the rake that took 2 doors from their hinges. They ran. Yellow Robe came after them with the impatience of a prince who has never heard no. He moved faster than a man and slower than a star. He spoke words that made the air heavy and the road long. Wukong turned and met him in a field of millet cut low. The iron staff and the sleeve with its hidden spells argued while the morning learned their names. The fight had the look of a game between equals that will not end without guests. Wukong shouted once without shame, and the sky answered. From the high halls, the 28 mansions came as sober as scholars and as bright as the stars they are named for. They stepped into a circle around the field and spoke the names that bind the disobedient among their number. Yellow Robe's fine robe turned ragged in an instant. His smooth face flickered and showed the stamp of heaven that had been burned off only in appearance. He was a fallen star, a minor celestial who had slipped his post for appetite and learned to eat what kings would not miss and what peasants could not defend. The constellations bound him in cords of light that he hated more than chains. They took him back to the upper court to answer old charges anew. The field smelled of crushed millet and victory that had required more help than pride likes to call for. Xuanzang stood and made a bow to the sky that was sincere without being servile. He made a smaller bow to Sun Wukong that was hard for both men and more healing than any charm. He spoke first. I asked you to leave when I should have asked you to stand closer. I saw faces and did not see truths. Wukong answered without ceremony. I struck the truth too hard and made it look like cruelty. Tie the ring only when you must. I will give you fewer chances to use it. They walked back to the road and found that Sha Wu Jing had already fetched the horse and the packs and had water boiling. Zhu Wuneng sat with his hands around a cup and a look on his face that he did not try to hide. Relief will do that to a man. They did not speak of banishment again that day. The ridge fell behind them, and the path opened toward lands where fire burns in the ground, and a child who breathes fire wears the title of Holy Infant. The fellowship was whole again, not as it had been, but as men become after they have broken trust and mended it. The land changed before they saw the first smoke. Birds fell silent one valley back. Pines thinned and gave way to scrub that crackled underfoot as if the soil were a banked coal. They came over a low saddle, and the valley below looked as if a god had dropped a brazier and never bothered to pick it up. Hills slumped in ribbons of black. A haze moved even when the wind slept. Where fields should have been, the earth was scored with old burns and fresh ones, each edged in ash as white as bone. The people who lived at the margins of that place had learned to speak softly and to keep their doors barred at noon. They told the same story in the same careful words. A lord had risen in the firelands. He was not a man, and he was not yet grown to a man's height. They called him Red Boy, and Holy Infant, and Son of the Bull King. He had built himself a court in a cave of stone that glowed at night like a kiln. He had set tithe and tribute. He had taken what he wished and burned what he did not wish. He laughed when men brought swords, and he put ashes where their names had been. The old men at the edge of the firelands remembered the father. The Bull Demon King had been a prince among demons when Sun Wukong still wore the mistake of youth like a cloak. They had sworn brotherhood then over wine and stolen peaches, and for a season they had divided the world into places to plunder and places to leave alone. That brotherhood had died by a slow arithmetic of pride and injury, and the last count had been written when Red Boy fell to Guan Yin's gentle chains. Princess Iron Fan kept a palace built on a breath of wind at the foot of a flaming ridge, and her fan had quenched fires for a price when it pleased her. This was the stock that had made the child who ruled the valley, a father who could trample granite, a mother who could move the wind with a flick of her wrist, a boy who had learned to breathe a flame that did not care about water. The pilgrims kept to the road where it still held shape. Ash drifted like grey rain across the white dragon horse's mane and left smears on Xuanzang's cassock. Zhu Wuneng wrapped a wet cloth around his snout and grumbled in a voice that carried no real complaint. Sha Wu Jing walked with his blade low and his eyes high, counting watch posts half buried in cinder and the black wings of crows who had learned to love heat. Sun Wukong said very little. He carried the iron staff on his shoulder and watched the sky as if it might bring a messenger with a familiar horned shadow. They came at last to a shrine beside a dry stream where the stones had cracked open like old bread. The shrine was newly painted and oddly neat, as if careful hands had tended it in a place where nothing could stay careful for long. A tablet on the altar bore the characters for mercy, and the incense bowl was full, proof that the fearful still hoped to pay for safety. A boy sat on the step with his feet in the dust, and a tear on his cheek that could have been placed there by a mother with good instincts. He said that pilgrims were not safe on this road, and begged them to take the shaded path around the hill, and he pointed where the dark promised relief for tired beasts and tired men. Wukong looked once and saw no boy. He saw heat wrapped in a polite shape. He saw the shimmer that surrounds a coal that pretends to be dead and is not. He touched Xuanzang's sleeve and shook his head. The monk nodded and turned from the shade to the hard white path. The boy watched them go and smiled with an adult's mouth on a child's face. A gust lifted Ash into a ring that moved with them like a dog that only needed the right word to bite. The attack came fast and seemed generous. A wind rose that felt like a favor at first, pushing from behind and lifting their robes and easing the weight of the packs. Then the wind turned hot and seized at throats. Flames walked before it in a low run. A circle closed of red and orange and purple where air itself burned. Samadhi fire has 3 fuels, and none of them are wood: spirit, breath, will. Water hisses against it like gossip and does nothing. Only the right charm, the right wind, or the right fan can bend it away. The ring tightened with a hiss that ate the air. The white dragon horse reared and almost threw the monk. Sha Wu Jing stepped to the circle's edge and struck with his crescent blade. The fire leaned back like a cat and then came in again. Zhu Wuneng plunged at it with his rake and snatched his hands away with a shout when the teeth glowed like candied fruit. Red Boy walked out of the heat as if from a curtain. He wore armor the color of ripe persimmon and a crown set with jewels that winked as if they were in on a joke. His face still held the roundness of a child, but the eyes were older than his years and full of the easy contempt of a prince who has never been made to wait. He bowed to the monk with a charm learned in a palace, and to Wukong with a small tilt of the head that was not quite a bow and not quite an insult. "Uncle," he said, with the sweet reluctance of a child acknowledging kin at a wedding. "My mother sends her regards. My father would be here to share them, but heaven has taken an interest in his travel papers." Wukong did not rise to the word uncle. He looked at the fire and judged its hunger. He looked at the boy's stance and saw where the training had been careful and where it had been neglected because no one who taught him had dared to bruise him. He said what mattered. "Let the monk go. You have no need to make a murderer of yourself today." Red Boy laughed in a way that showed small square teeth. "Murder is a word for courts. This is an altar. I have a festival planned, and your master is the only guest worth seating close to the drum." He snapped his fingers, and the ring of fire breathed like a living thing and broke the company apart as neatly as a sword stroke. Wukong was thrown back into a tumble of hot ash. Zhu Wuneng slipped and went to one knee and came up gasping. Sha Wujing set himself like a stake in a riverbed and held the worst of it for a heartbeat and then another, and even he was pushed aside. Xuanzang stood alone with the flame at his back. The boy stepped forward and tugged lightly at the bridle of the white horse. The animal froze, not from fear but from a charm that had learned his true name. Red Boy took the reins with the leisure of an aristocrat taking a falcon on the wrist for a walk on a clear day. Wukong leapt, and the iron staff met a spear that Red Boy flicked from his sleeve as if it were a toy. The first clash gave back a sound like a bell. The second threw sparks that hung in the air without falling. The third sent a sting up Wukong's arms that told him this was no trick born solely of pride. The boy had been taught by one who knew forms. Then the spear tip breathed, and the breath was fire, and the iron staff glowed in Wukong's grip. He tore off a handful of hair and blew it into a small army that swarmed at the child from 3 sides. Red Boy laughed again and set the wind of his own lungs against them. The hairs burned in a blink, and the air stank of singed fur and pride. Wukong shifted shape to break the ring. He turned river serpent and burned, turned gold-winged bird and smoked, turned bear and felt the heat crawl through the hide like ants with knives. Zhu Wuneng rushed in and came back with blistered palms and a grin that did not reach his eyes. Sha Wujing called a mild rain that turned to steam and bit his face. The fire obeyed a deeper law. It fed on will and breath and the groove of a destiny well trained. Red Boy tightened the circle and drew near as if strolling through a garden. He spoke once to the monk as a court tutor speaks to a pupil. "Step here and I will carry you from dust to honor." Xuanzang answered with a single holy name and nothing else. The boy flicked his fingers and cords of red light leapt from the fire and bound wrist and ankle and throat. The white dragon horse froze under a charm that knew his true name. One tug and the child prince led the captive away with the calm of a hunter certain of his quarry. They tracked the burn to a cliff mouth shaped like a kiln. Flaming cloud cave breathed heat in slow waves. Drums moved like a cook's heartbeat. Within, servants laid herbs and ghee beside a bronze pot, while their small lord paced with the self-possession of a prince who had never failed at anything he cared to do. Wukong stood in the wind and measured ruin against pride. He could break the outer door, and perhaps the second. He could not keep the cauldron from boiling if he fought on their ground. He looked south, where willow roots hold a riverbank together. He tasted ash and let it go. Then he sent a single hair on the wind with a plea that did not dress itself as swagger. Tell her that a hard-headed ape asks for help. The wind took the message with the care a good servant gives a fragile thing, and went where mercy keeps a house. Wukong went to the ridge where the wind could clear the smoke from his head, and did the hardest thing a fighter learns. He asked. The plea rode a single hair into the dark like a spark that seeks tinder, and found a quiet shore where willow leaves drink from a jade vase. Morning had barely touched the cliffs when the air cooled and the reed beds stood straighter. A traveller in a plain robe walked up the black rock as if it were a garden path. Her eyes held the patient light of a temple lamp that never goes out. She listened while the Monkey King spoke without swagger, a boy lord with samadhi fire, a captive ready for the kettle, a cave that is a furnace and a fortress both. Guan Yin nodded once. Her hands were empty, and that meant the hall was already full. They went down together to the kiln mouth. Red Boy stood within, pleased with his stage. Attendants set in pairs like chessmen, the bronze cauldron washed and waiting. He saw an old nun at the threshold and laughed as princes laugh when a child wanders into a game for men. He told her to go and beg at some honest door. Guan Yin answered him as a schoolmaster answers a clever pupil just before the switch. She called him by his courtesy name, and by the name his mother had used when he was small. The servants went still. The boy's smile chipped. He answered with heat. The ring flared up from the floor, and the white fire climbed the soot walls as if called home. The wind in the valley turned and pressed flame toward the door. Guan Yin did not move. The robe did not singe. The willow branch in her hand did not blacken. The sweet dew from the vase fell in a light arc, and the fire leaned away as if scenting a larger law. Red Boy narrowed his eyes and showed what he had been taught in real lessons. He drew breath slow through the nose and fed the fire with will instead of wind. The heat deepened. The floor cracked in a flower of red lines. Wukong started forward and her sleeve stopped him by not touching him at all. "Watch," she said without speaking. She made a child's mischief of a smile and became someone else. A village maiden stood where the nun had been, bright as a banner on market day. She cried for help in a voice that could have lured saints from cell doors. Red Boy smirked and would not step near. He had been fooled by Wukong too many ways to count, and counted that lesson learned. The maiden vanished. A peddler appeared with charms and tonics that promised more than they could give. The boy still did not move. A poor scholar bowed and begged a place by the hearth. Red Boy laughed and tightened the cords on Xuanzang's wrists, with a thought to show he was still the master of the room. Guan Yin changed her play. She brought no disguise at all. She set a lotus stool on the cave floor with a touch of the willow and invited the boy to sit and speak as an equal. She asked about his teachers and his practice and the way he steadied his breath. The questions were good ones. A real student will step closer to teach the teacher how to ask better. Pride brought him within reach, and courtesy put him on the seat. The lotus blinked once as a living thing does when it wakes. Petals closed around shins and hips and shoulders with the steady patience of a tide. Golden cords ran out like vines and took wrist and ankle, before the boy remembered the lesson about gifts that arrive at your own threshold. He spat a tongue of fire long enough to cook an ox. The dew in the jade vase fell in 3 silver drops and turned the flame aside like a hand that guides a child away from a well. The The servants broke and ran for the side doors. Wukong was there before them, the iron staff drawing a quiet circle that meant, live if you go to ground and die if you test the line. He cut the cords from Xuanzang with a care that felt like apology and lifted him down from the iron rings. The monk's breath was steady, his voice was low. I knew you would ask. I did not know you would be heard. Wukong bowed without words, and for once did not look to see who noticed. Red Boy cursed as boys curse when the game turns. He dragged against the lotus and found that every struggle seated him deeper. The Bodhisattva did not mock him. She told him what the future could be if he chose it. The path of appetite ends in a kitchen of someone else's making. The path of skill ends in a service that does not humiliate a proud heart. I will teach you breath without fire and will without cruelty. Call me mother, and learn how to burn only what should burn. He tried defiance because defiance was the only coin he had ever spent. It bought nothing here. The cords eased when he stopped pulling, and tightened when he tried to spit flame again. He was very young. He began to cry the way princes cry when there is no one left to carry their grief for them. He yielded at last with a small word that men in armor could not have forced from him. Mother. The cords released like a fist unclenching. The lotus opened. Guanyin tapped his brow with the willow, and the heat in him settled from a weapon into a skill. She gave him a simple name to practice humility. Shankai. He stood shakily and bowed. The bow was ugly and perfect. In that moment the cave changed. The drums died. The air cooled. Smoke rose and drifted apart like a council that has ended. They came out to a valley that remembered green. The ring of fire on the meadow was gone, and the scorched grass wore a new smell as clean as river stone. Xuanzang thanked Guanyin with the formality due a savior and a teacher both. She answered that the road would be long, and there were temptations ahead that wear silk and smiles, and would not announce themselves with drums. She set a hand for a breath on Wukong's head. Pride confessed quickly is wisdom waking, she said, and the gold band grew warm without pain. Then she turned and walked away with the boy who had called her mother only once and would learn to mean it. They watched until the two were small figures against the ribs of the hills. Zhu Vuneng let out the breath he had been holding since the first wind rose and made a joke that was not very good and was a relief all the same. Sha Wujing shouldered the packs and looked east and west and measured the distance to the next river. Wukong stood with the iron staff grounded and thought of a bull with iron in his heart and a lady with a fan that could move mountains of fire. He had saved the monk and the land for a day. He had also touched a nerve that would wake an old brother to anger. Some debts do not sleep when a child is taken from a house. The fellowship set out while the ash was still soft underfoot. The sky opened blue above them. The white horse carried the monk with his ears forward, cautious and willing. The road bent toward groves where silk spiders make palaces for their hunger, and toward a temple where a smiling host keeps tea hot for travelers who do not yet know his name. The land softened into a valley of green where even the wind seemed polite. Willow canopies drooped over a clear stream, and the air smelled of crushed mint. After weeks of ash and scorched hills, the place felt like a promise kept. Birds fretted in the reeds and dragonflies stitched blue lines above the water. Yet the old earth deity had no incense on his ledge, and the shrine door hung half open as if a host had fled in a hurry. Wukong watched the treetops for the wrong kind of stillness and found it. Xuanzang heard only water and the distant call of a woodcutter's song and felt his shoulders loosen. Zhu Wuneng did not bother to hide his grin. Sha Wujing let his blade rest across his knees and said nothing, which was his way of saying the ground deserved caution. They found the maidens where the stream widened into a silver bowl. 7 of them stood knee-deep, hair dark as lacquer, skin bright as candlelight, garments tossed on the bank like fallen petals. Laughter carried across the water with the easy confidence of the very young. They cried out in delight at the sight of travellers, and waved them near with a courtesy that would have shamed a court. Zhu Wuneng forgot hunger and remembered a different appetite. Xuanzang lowered his eyes and offered a blessing for strangers. Wukong looked and did not look. His furnace-burned eyes saw the seam in the picture. The reflections of the 7 did not match the tilt of their chins. A thin glimmer moved just under the skin, like moonlight on threads. Between one blink and the next, the water around their knees quivered as if disturbed by more legs than a human should own. They led the company to a cave mouth, veiled with hanging silk that swayed without wind. Inside, lamps burned with a soft white flame. A table had been laid with rice fragrant with pandan and small skewers of river fish brushed with honey. A bedchamber opened beyond, piled with quilts and cushions and a brazier where sandalwood smoked. The hostesses poured wine that was cool despite the afternoon and urged the monk to take the cup first. Xuanzang thanked them and lifted it, and the rings on his staff chimed once in a voice he had learned to trust. Wukong's hand moved, and the cup slid from the monk's fingers and emptied itself on the flagstones. The wine hissed and ate at the glaze like vinegar poured on chalk. The smiles did not falter, which told more than any scowl. The maidens leaned close with kindness that arrived too quickly. Silk cords unwound from their sleeves and drifted like spidering threads on a spring breeze. The cords tightened around wrists and ankles with a will that did not belong to cloth. Xuanzang went down in a breath, trussed as neatly as a festival goose. Sha Wujing chopped twice and freed one hand and took 3 strands across the face that burned like nettles. Zhu Wuneng swung the rake and snagged a curtain of web, only to find it pull him forward, as if the cave itself wished to swallow him whole. The 7 shapes shed politeness like a robe. Hair lifted and crackled. Skin took a pale luster that was not human. At each navel a glossy spinneret winked and spat new line. They laughed now without bothering to sound lovely. Wukong grew very still in the middle of the storm, then split his shadow and his breath until there were 3 faces and 6 hands, and the iron staff became 6 lengths of black light. He struck the pillars to break the web's geometry, and the cave boomed like a drum. He feinted left with one body and cut right with another, and used the third to scoop the monk clear by the loop of a cord that had not quite found a knot. Sha Wujing planted his crescent blade and worked like a ferryman in flood, hacking paths through glue that fought back. Zhu Wuneng, wiser for once, went low to anchor the line and hauled Xuanzang toward the light with his whole body, while the rake kept the nearest demoness just out of throat range. Bones showed themselves in corners where silk bundles had been stacked with care. Jaw hinges gaped in a mute chorus. The hostesses hissed and spat bright threads as strong as kite cable. Wukong answered with hairs of his own that tangled the first volley long enough to close the distance. He smashed a loom, and with it the trick of the room that had made every thread find its mark. The sisters changed tactics to survive. One cast a net that filled the doorway and bought time. Two tried to pin the Monkey King from opposite flanks and learned why soldiers drill on angles. The others gathered the wounded and fled into a side passage that breathed cold air and stank faintly of cellar mould. Wukong followed as far as the turning, where a trap waits for any guest who has grown too confident. He stopped. Pride had cost enough men their names in caves like this. He broke the web at the door with a measured blow and let the fugitives keep the dark they knew. In the open air, the world looked honest again. Xuanzang sat on a stone and rubbed at his wrists without complaint. He had prayed while they worked, and the prayer had been the stubborn kind that keeps the voice low and the spine straight. Sha Wujing rinsed his face in the stream and watched the banks without seeming to watch them. Zhu Wuneng tried a joke and got no answer and did not mind. Wukong stood at the lip of the water and tasted the breeze. It carried the edge of a promise. The Spider Sisters would not swallow their humiliation and let the tale end here. They had friends in these hills, patient and poisonous both, and night was a net they knew how to cast. He told the others to eat quickly and drink only what steamed in their sight. They left the ruined cave with the sun tilting west and the stream whispering as if relieved. Behind them lay torn silks and a feast meant for bones. Ahead the path bent toward a temple with a smiling host and a kettle set just so on the coals. The valley had given them beauty as bait. It would try wit next, and then cunning sharpened to a point. Xuanzang thanked his guardian with a single look that admitted more than 100 words. Wukong nodded once and turned his face to the road. They left the stream and the ruined silk cave behind and found a temple on a low rise. Old bricks leaning, roof tiles missing, bell rope frayed white where many hands had pulled. Smoke rose from a brazier that should have been cold at that hour. A monk in a plain robe stepped out and bowed with the calm of a host who has expected guests all day. His voice was warm and his offers were simple. Water drawn at dawn, tea with a sprig of mint, a place to sit while the sun slid behind the ridge. Weariness makes liars of caution. Xuanzang accepted with a nod. Zhu Wuneng grinned at the steam. Sha Wujing stacked the packs where he could reach them in one motion. Wukong drank last and very little. The host's eyes gleamed as if oil lay on them in a thin skin, a many-faceted sheen that caught every lamp. In the dark of the pupils there was a second dark that did not belong to men. He set his cup down and asked the monk which rule he followed. The host named 3 schools without stumbling and recited a verse in a voice that was almost correct. The word almost is a bell only the wary hear. Zhu Wuneng's shoulders loosened. Sha Wujing blinked slow and set his hand on the wrong side of his blade. Xuanzang's lips moved in a blessing, and the blessing faltered as the floor tilted under him. The tea was not strong, it was exact. The host smiled, and the smile thinned to a line. Skin split and ran like wax down a candle. The robe fell away from a body banded in chitin. 100 legs clicked on the stone. The mouth opened sideways and showed the hooks that hold and pump. The centipede immortal loomed over the monk and raised a blade shaped like a thorn ripped from the trunk of an old tree. He called out softly to the shadows, and 2 of the Spider Sisters crept from the side aisle with silk still wrapped around their waists like sashes. They were bruised and angry and hungry for revenge. The centipede pointed the thorn toward Xuanzang's throat and spoke as a merchant speaks when a deal has already been done. Give me the captives you took from the cave and I will let the holy man breathe. Refuse and I will teach your master how quick a prayer can end. Wukong measured bargains in the time it takes a heart to beat. If he tested the blade, the throat would open. If he parleyed, the net would tighten. He took two bound sisters by the scruffs of their necks and snapped them against the flagstones as a farmer snaps a snake before it bites a child. The sound was clean and final and ugly to remember. He said nothing to justify it. He used the outrage to strike. The iron staff cracked the nave pillar and sent a curtain of dust through the hall. The centipede shrieked and spat a fan of venom that stung like ground pepper in the eyes. Wukong swung blind and found only air. Claws swept and tore a strip from his shoulder. Zhu Wuneng lurched up from the floor and caught a blow on his rake that rang in the rafters, then sagged again as the drug worked in him like winter. Sha Wujing stood with his blade in both hands and held the monster off the monk for the space of 2 short breaths, which was as brave as any charge on any battlefield. Light moved at the threshold and the hall remembered how to be a temple. A wanderer stepped across the sill with a small jeweled bowl in one hand and a staff in the other. The Bodhisattva Pilanju does not come with thunder. She arrives like a remedy put at the bedside in the night. Her chant was quiet, and the sound did not echo. The centipede sprang and found the air thick as syrup. The bowl in her hand widened like a mouth. A spiral of light took the monster at the thorax and turned its 100 legs inward. Hooks scraped stone and left sparks, then lifted and vanished. The hall smelled suddenly of crushed cedar and rain. The venom that had been flung into Wukong's eyes ran cold and clean as if it wished to be water again. Xuanzang's breath came back in long, careful pulls. Zhu Wuneng groaned and rubbed his face and promised the ancestors he would never drink tea again that was not boiled in front of him. Sha Wujing bowed once to the Bodhisattva and let his blade rest. They stepped into the courtyard where the sky could be trusted. The jeweled bowl sat on the altar, and the thing inside beat its body against the light and made no more noise than a beetle in a jar. Pilanju spoke a few plain words about appetite and patience and the price of cruelty. She did not praise Wukong, and she did not rebuke him. She looked at Xuanzang. The monk's face was white with anger that had nowhere safe to go. The 2 dead sisters lay where they had fallen, one with her arm thrown over her eyes like a woman who does not wish to see the morning. Xuanzang turned to his guardian and spoke as a man speaks when he chooses grief over pride. "I cannot bless this." Wukong answered without bowing and without heat. "If I had blinked, you would be a story told in kitchens. Some kindness feeds wolves." They buried what was left beside the temple wall, because even enemies deserve earth. Pilanju took her bowl and her quiet away into the trees. The 4 travelers gathered their packs and found the road again without speaking much. The evening smelled of resin and damp stone. Zhu Wuneng walked with his head low and his rake high, as if he wanted to be ready for the next thing and still not see it coming. Sha Wujing kept the line tight and watched the edges. Wukong travelled in a silence that was not sulking. He had won, and he had lost something he could not name. Xuanzang prayed under his breath and tried to fit mercy and survival into the same bowl and found that the bowl had cracks. They camped beyond the rise where the temple bell could not be heard. Stars came out in their thousands. The wind turned and brought a dry heat from far away. It smelled of iron and ash, and a mountain that burns without wood. Wukong stared into the dark and knew the scent. A fan that can move fire. A lord with horns who once called him brother. A lady who never forgets a debt. The road had bent toward Flaming Mountain whether they liked it or not. The road lifted into a range the locals called a furnace with no walls. The air turned restless and dry. Stones sweated heat that had never known rain. Far ahead a glare lay on the land like a sheet of hammered copper. The old songs say the fire began when a crucible in the alchemy hall of heaven tipped and spilled its embers to earth. The scholars in the nearest prefecture wrote that hot winds from the western deserts find a home in those gullies and never quite leave. The truth walked between the two. The mountain burned whether men argued about the cause or not. At the last bend they looked down on a city that had learned to live under a red sky. Crimson lotus stood in a bowl of stone with cisterns sunk deeper than wells and clay pipes that groaned like old men. The fields around it had gone to stubble and dust. Children played in streets, swept clean, not from pride, but to keep the ash from lying too thick on the tongue. When the gate captain heard the rings on Xuanzang's staff, he set the escort aside and offered salt and water as if a shrine had stood at his post. The magistrate came in soft shoes and spoke with a careful courtesy that belongs to men who have run out of other tools. The city needs a wind that cools, he said, and there is only one fan in all the earth that can draw such a wind. It hangs on the wrist of a lady who has no reason to care for our thirst. Princess Ironfan kept her house on a slope where the heat did not trouble her stones. A grove of plantains stood outside her gate, leaves broad as shields and green as spring despite the fire that walked this country. Servants in neat ranks watched the road and did not blink when they saw a monk, a monkey, a boar man, and a blue-skinned giant come up the path with the patience of men who are not at home. Wukong sent his companions to shade and stepped through the gate alone. He greeted the mistress of the house as sister to an old brother rather than as a foe. He used the right name for her child and did not use the name the court had given him in chains. He asked for the loan of the banana leaf fan to cool a mountain and save a city that could not pay for such mercy. Princess Iron Fan was a beauty of the old sort, the kind that has learned to set its own price. Her gaze held the courtesy of a hostess and the edge of a knife. She poured tea that tasted faintly of smoke and sweet grass and heard him out. Then she gave back a reply that had the plain sense of a ledger. You and yours came like a storm to my house and took my son from my lap and gave him to a vow I did not choose. Do not speak to me of thirst. She lifted the fan once in a gesture that was almost idle. A gust went down the path and lifted tiles and made the plantain leaves clap like hands. Wukong skidded across the court and found himself in the road with grit in his mouth. He came back and asked again without raising his voice. She opened the fan a second time and the wind rose to a wall and shoved him through the gate, down the steps, and into the dust before the eyes of his friends. He sat a while at the foot of the hill with ash on his face and pride burning hotter than the stones. Zhu Wuneng muttered that some doors do not open for truth before noon. Xiao Wujing said nothing and watched the servants on the wall count their breaths. The monk placed a steadying hand on Wukong's arm and spoke of patience. Wukong did not need a sermon. He needed a trick. That night he went up the slope as a moth and watched the guard change. He learned the hour when the hall fell to quiet, and the hour when Princess Ironfan took wine alone, and the way she smiled at the portrait of a man with horns who had once filled that room with laughter. At dawn a traveller came to the gate with the steady tread of a lord returning from a successful hunt. He was tall and broad and wore a robe cut for strength instead of show. His brow sprouted horns sheathed in iron. His gaze had that ease only kings who have fought for their crowns seem to keep. Servants fell to their knees and the steward ran, weeping with relief. The princess went white and then flushed like a girl and called her husband by his name. The bull demon king embraced her and kissed her brow and asked for the fan with the voice a husband uses when he means to be obeyed. She placed it in his hands at once. The door closed, the lock turned. The lord in the courtyard laughed like a stream running over stones. His shoulders narrowed and his horns went away. The bull king was a monkey again, very pleased with himself and eager to be gone. He bowed to the empty air for the sake of the two servants he knew were watching from behind a screen and strolled down the steps. He lengthened his stride when he reached the path. He did not quite run. He did not need to. He had the fan in his sleeve and a city to save and a mountain to tame and a lesson to teach an old friend about soft spots in old armor called love. He did not reach the first switchback before the ground shook once in warning. Hooves thundered above the clatter of loose stone. A shadow fell across the path as if a cliff had learned to move. The real bull demon king stood in the road that led to his house. Iron-tipped horns bright, eyes loud with rage that had been fed very well. He did not bother with subtlety. He looked at the shape-changer who had worn his face, and at the sleeve that hid the fan, and at the mountain that had burned ever since. Heaven lost its temper, and he laid the whole sum at the feet of a single traitor. Old friendships carry a weight that can crack the earth. Wukong felt the road under his feet and judged the distance to the next bend and the way the wind might favor a leap. He did not run. He knew a chase he could not win. When he saw one, he stood his ground and smiled in a way that showed his teeth and not his thoughts, and addressed the Bull King as brother by the name they had used in days when toasts were made to rebellion and the future was a game for clever men. The Bull King answered as a husband who has had his household shaken and a father who has had his son taken from his table. He demanded the fan. He demanded an apology. He demanded an end to the road that had led the Monkey King to every door and to every pride. Wukong looked at the city in the bowl, and the river that had learned to creep along its bed like a lizard, and the mountain that burned without wood. He looked at the woman on the terrace, small now but still watching. He felt the iron staff behind his ear where it sat like a judge. He drew it and let it find its true weight. The Bull King lowered his head and pawed the earth once, and the mountain seemed to answer with a shiver. They stepped toward each other as men who have shared wine and war and now share nothing but purpose. The first clash sang along the slope and sent lizards scurrying from cracks. Iron met iron, and the air quivered. Wukong slipped past a hook of horn and tapped the Bull King's ribs hard enough to count as an insult. The Bull King answered with a sweep of his cudgel that tore a plantain from the ground and turned it into green confetti. Servants dove for the steps. Princess Iron Fan stood very still behind her screen and pressed both hands to the lattice until the pattern marked her skin. In the bowl below, the city watched a dust plume rise and tried to pretend that what happened on the slopes of other people's houses could not change the measure of their thirst. The fight would run until every polite mask had been broken. The fan lay between them, the mountain behind them, and a promise to a starving city in the balance. When the Bull King charged a second time, the ridge itself seemed to lean. Wukong settled his feet and smiled the smile he wore when the day promised to cost more than pride and to pay better than victory won with ease. They met like old oaks in a gale. The Bull Demon King came low with the weight of a hillside behind his horns. Wukong slipped inside the hook and wrapped the ribs to test the armor, then took a rush that would have broken an ox and let it glance away on the iron staff. The slope shook with every trade, plantain tore, tiles leapt from the roof and clattered down the steps. The servants shrank into the doorways and watched through their fingers. Princess Iron Fan stood behind the screen without blinking, one hand at her throat and the other on the lattice, knuckles white. They traded forms when reach and weight could not settle the question. The Bull King became a yellow bull broad as a gate and dug furrows in the court with his hooves. Wukong became a black tiger that moved like smoke and took the horns on his shoulder and rolled clear. The bull became a white crane and lifted with a beat that rattled shutters. The tiger became a goshawk and met him in the hot air above the terrace with a scream that sent the gardeners to their knees. They fell back to man shapes and fought again with cudgel and staff until the stones under their feet sweated and cracked. It might have gone on until the mountain made its own judgment if the lady had not stepped from behind the screen and shown the edge that had kept her house intact in a country of men who admire force. She spoke her husband's name once in a low tone that carried into every corner of the court. The Bull King's head turned because the tone was one no warrior learns to ignore. In that sliver of breath, the Monkey King put aside pride and used guile. He left a shadow to hold the front, slipped small as a gnat through the curtain, and rode a current of sandalwood to the wine cup waiting at the lady's elbow. She raised the cup to wet a throat gone dry with fear and fury. The gnat went with the wine. The palace learned a new sound. It was not the shout of anger or the ring of iron. It was the hiss that escapes a woman who has just taken a swallow and discovered a wasp in her chest. Wukong stung from within with the care of a surgeon who knows exactly where the body keeps its stubbornness. The pain took Princess Iron Fan's breath and bent her forward over the table. She did not cry out. She set the cup down by force and whispered to the empty air that she would rather bargain than retch blood. The gnat became a monkey no larger than a child standing on the rim of the bowl, then grew to his full height as if pulling the room up with him. He spoke softly so the Bull King would not hear. Lend the fan, save the city. I will send your son to your threshold when the vows that keep him safe allow it. Her gaze did not leave his. She had been tricked twice in one day, and still she weighed the larger truth. Pride is dear. Drought is dearer. She lifted the screen and called to her husband with the calm of a queen who has chosen a course. The Bull King saw the bargain in her face and roared a refusal that shook dust from the beams. He rushed again to take the fan from sleeve or from body if he had to break both. That brought old debts down from the high halls. Cloud banners billowed above the ridge. Marshal Li Jing set his pagoda on the wind with measured hands. Nezha came in a wheel of fire with a grin that did not reach his eyes. The 36 Thunder Generals formed 2 ranks across the path with their halberds at the exact same angle. The Bull King had beaten gods before, but on lonely roads and at times of his choosing. Here the numbers spoke. He fought as a husband fights for a house, and still the cords of light closed. Nezha's spear bit the space before his heart and held it. Li Jing dropped the pagoda and the glow-pinned horn and wrist. They bound him without insult and stood back at a sign from Wukong, for a brother is a brother even when the law comes late. Princess Iron Fan watched without flinching and held out the banana leaf fan with both hands. The silk spines were green as spring, and the surface caught the light like water. She did not beg, and she did not threaten. She set terms in a voice that left no room for error. Cool the mountain, give the city back its knights. Return the fan before the second moon wanes. Keep the talk of our house out of the mouths of men who have never kept a house. Wukong bowed. The bow was awkward and it was honest. Xuanzang thanked her as one ruler thanks another for a treaty that spares a nation. They climbed to the saddle where the wind comes down first, and where the heat had baked the ridgeline to the color of pottery. The city lay below like a patient on a bed. Wukong stood with his feet set and raised the fan. Once and a breath, twice and a breath, thrice, and the gust rolled off the slope and tumbled into the gullies and came up again cooler than it had gone down. He kept on, 7 and 7 again, 49 in the old count. The fire backed away like an army that has discovered it is outflanked. The ground lost its shimmer. Plants that had lain flat lifted by a finger's width. A small wind came smelling of wet stone and far snow. Children in crimson lotus laughed and did not understand that something old had broken and something older had been restored. They gave the fan back the same day. Princess Iron Fan took it with a face that showed nothing and everything. The Bull King stood bound to honor in the court, not to humiliation, and listened while the monk spoke a few words about sons and vows, and the manner in which pride can be served by restraint. He did not answer. He looked to the slope where the glare had faded, and did a small thing with his shoulders that told his wife the heat in his chest had cooled by a degree. Nezha and Li Jing lifted their cords, and the great lord stood free. He did not offer a hand, and Wukong did not ask for one. They watched each other like men who know they will meet again and hope it will be at a table and not on a ridge. The company took the pass at dawn while the stones still held the night. The world west of Flaming Mountain felt changed in the way the air feels after a storm, not cleaner so much as clearer about its shapes. Xuanzang rode with his eyes half closed and his lips moving in gratitude that had no witnesses but the white horse and the sky. Xu Waneng trudged with an air of virtue and managed to keep it until noon. Xiao Wujing walked behind and counted the steps to the next river without letting the number touch his face. Wukong carried the iron staff at an easy angle and did not turn back. He had stolen and begged and earned and returned. Cunning had served mercy and not pride, and that was a lesson worth keeping. They came down into a plain of tall grass that hid birds the size of dogs and villages that turned out all their bowls to greet a pilgrim. A long road cut west like a brushstroke on silk. The last mountains lifted on the horizon as faint as smoke. Beyond them lay the Thunderclap Monastery and a hall where a calm face waits without worrying the clock. The fellowship walked toward that far quiet with the steadiness of men who have measured themselves against fire and thirst, and found both greater and less than fear had painted them. They crossed the last range with the steadiness of men who have left their anger behind in a country that no longer needs it. The air thinned and cleared. The world lifted into wide plateaus where the wind spoke without malice, and the light fell clean on stone that remembered no wars. On the far rim of that stillness rose Spirit Mountain, white with the patience of snow and green with pines that do not age. Bells spoke where no hand pulled rope. The valley smelled of cedar and distant rain, though no cloud marked the sky. Xuanzang set foot on the flagstones of the Thunderclap Monastery and bowed with a gratitude so plain that even the door guardians inclined their heads. They were received not as beggars, but as envoys who had kept faith. The Tathagata did not blaze. He arrived as a change in weight, and in that change old aches lifted from the shoulders of all who stood beneath his gaze. He asked no long questions. He had watched enough to know the answers before they were given. The monk made his petition without ornament. The East needs the Dharma in a tongue its children can dream in. The Buddha nodded as a teacher nods when a difficult student at last asks the right thing. He sent them to the sutra treasury, where shelves ran higher than any court wall and every roll of silk smelled faintly of sandalwood and ink. There was one last test of manners dressed as a test of faith. The keepers handed them scrolls with no words. The paper was fine. The emptiness rang. Wukong frowned and would have spoken sharply, but Sha Wujing touched his sleeve and Zhu Wuneng cleared his throat. Xuanzang understood that even a monastery eats rice and burns oil and must keep its lamps filled. He presented the golden alms bowl the emperor had given him at the start and asked that poverty be allowed to do its duty to gratitude. The keepers smiled as men smile when a pupil discovers a tool that was in his hands all along. They brought out the real baskets, and the words breathed on the silk like rivers that would never run dry. The road eastward went easier, because the heart does not stumble as much when it carries what it was made to carry. Dangers still came, wolves in silk, magistrates with soft mouths, bridges that sagged under honest weight. They kept the count of trials as old folk keep the tally of winters, 81 in all by the reckoning of those who love a number to seal a tale. At the last ford a water fiend made a final claim and found that its claws could not hold what heaven had already written into ledgers it does not show to men. Chang'an heard the bell strokes before the watchman saw the dust. The Emperor Taizong came to the southern gate with the court in full rank, and a city that had learned to live without marvels for a season remembered how to breathe when marvels return. The scriptures were set in a palace hall, and the doors were opened so that common men could see the promise that had cost so much walking. A pagoda rose in time as the emperor had vowed, and masons set each brick like a prayer while the city watched the lines go up clean. The monks of the great temple began to copy and teach, and scholars who had grown clever in the old fashions learned to bow to a sentence that did not begin with them. Merit was weighed as a harvest is weighed when the carts reached the yard. The Tathagata kept his own tally and spoke the names that followed. Xuanzang was made the Buddha of sandalwood merit, the same golden cicada that had fallen long ago now restored to a seat that does not wobble. Son Wukong was named Buddha victorious in strife, his iron laugh finally hammered into a bell that calls men to steadiness rather than to war. Sha Wujing stood robed in a calm that matched his work and took his place as a golden-bodied arhat, the quiet strength at the back of any hall. The dragon horse shed the bridle of service and rose in cloud as a heavenly dragon with a clear eye and an earned pride. Zhu Baji smiled through the ceremony with a familiar hunger and found himself appointed cleansing attendant of the altars, which is merciful work for a man who needs to eat and needs to be needed both. There were visits made that did not fit in proclamations. Wukong climbed again to Flower Fruit Mountain and stood at the waterfall where a nation of monkeys still bathed and bickered. He sat on the old stone chair and found it smaller than his back remembered and kinder than his pride had allowed. He left the staff sleeping behind his ear and taught the young to grip a branch and to let go. He went also to a terrace where plantain leaves clap in a burnt country and returned a courtesy without asking for one. Princess Ironfan looked at him a long time and did not smile or frown. She asked if her son was well. He said yes, and meant it. The bull demon king came out to the steps and lifted a cup and did not speak. They drank, two old rebels who had learned what it costs to keep a house standing. Xuanzang knelt in the palace and spoke for the dead he had met on the road. Bandits hung from crossroads, farmers drowned in seasonal spite, girls who disappeared into bad doors and never found their way back. He asked for laws that bite clean and for granaries that open before the last sack is gone. Taizong heard and made a few decrees that held for longer than anyone expected. A good word spoken to a willing ear is also a kind of scripture. When the copying was done and the first pupils began to chant in a tone that made old men straighten their spines, the fellowship went their separate ways in the manner of men who have shared a long fire and no longer need to sit close to feel its heat. They could find one another again without trying, a ring of staff bells, a gust that smelled of peach and rain, the clap of a leaf in a country that still remembers thirst. The road they had worn west did not vanish. It became a line on maps and a habit in hearts. Pilgrims who came after found mile markers already laid by other feet, and courage cached in shrines by travellers who had kept back a little strength for the next soul. The high heaven kept its doors open a finger width wider. Courts learned slowly. They had learned a measure that year. The underworld groomed its ledgers with a touch less relish, and remembered that a name is a person before it is a line to be drawn through with a brush. The Western paradise did not change. It never does. What changes is the eye that looks at it, and the step that decides to keep walking. In the end, the tale belongs to a vow, a monk with a bowl and a staff and a patience that anger could not ruin, a monkey who learned that cunning serves best when it kneels to mercy, a boar who discovered that work feeds a hunger that wine cannot touch, a river guardian who carried the last burden without complaint, a horse that remembered he was a dragon and bore a saint across a continent without throwing him once. They brought back silk that breathed with meaning and left behind a road that other feet could trust. The mountain stands, the wind speaks, the bell answers. The story is finished and will not end.